You're good to go.
Okay, it is 6:01, and good evening and welcome to tonight's study session of the Boulder City. I'm Councilmember Wallach, and I thank you for joining us. We have on tonight's agenda 3 items. Our first item will be a discussion on the Area 3 Planning Reserve Urban Services Study Update, Draft Scenario Evaluation. It's quite a title. Our second item is the Core Arterial Network, CAN, Iris Avenue Transportation Improvement Project update. And our last item will be a very brief discussion on whether we want staff to engage with the petitioners on the language of the 2 airport petitions ballot language initiatives. With that, before we go into our work items, I'm going to outline how the meeting will be conducted. We will review staff's presentation for each item, and then we will have a time for questions. At the end of the presentations, we will conduct our council discussion with staff. So if you have questions, please wait for staff to complete their presentation. We will now turn to our very esteemed city manager, Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide, to introduce our first item. Nuria, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, council member. And I know we've got a lot of items on the agenda, so I'm going to be very brief and turn it straight over to staff this evening because we got a lot to talk about. And with that, I don't know, KJ, if you or Brad are going to kick us off, and I see that you are up. So KJ, take it away.
Thank you, Nuria, and good evening, City Council. Always a pleasure to spend a Thursday evening with you. Christopher Johnson, Comprehensive Planning Manager. I did want to start the evening with just some framing comments for you all to consider before I pass it off to Sarah Horn and the AECOM team for the presentation and discussion this evening related to the Area 3 Planning Reserve. So the full name actually of this first step of the process to explore the planning reserve as it is defined in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan is called the Baseline Urban Services Study. Now, we intentionally removed the term baseline just because it made the name very long, but also we wanted to avoid confusion with Baseline Road since the planning reserve itself is located on the opposite side, on the north side of the city. However, in reflection, in particular for the discussion this evening, and ultimately as we come forward with the final study later this fall, that term of baseline is very important because it helps to really clearly define the purpose of the study, which is to establish a baseline of foundational information upon which then we can analyze the potential impacts of urban development in the plan reserve on the rest of the city. That baseline then in the future can serve as a tool or as a floor by which then we can measure and inform future conversations around a variety of policy choices and trade-offs and alternative solutions. So the baseline that we're creating and that will be documented within the urban services study is really based on very high level 30,000 foot assumptions to evaluate an order of magnitude understanding of the infrastructure improvements, but it does not accommodate really detailed land use design or full engineering. So that's a bit of a caveat for everybody to just understand. And really, in other words, the study is intended to help us all identify those pinch points and really highlight the critical questions that will be asked in future steps, but it will not advise on creative and innovative solutions to ultimately resolve those questions. So the goal for tonight is to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the framework of the demand scenario bookends that we've established and provide a glimpse into some of the preliminary considerations that are starting to reveal themselves through some early analysis. I will guarantee that we will not have all the answers tonight and that additional financial and infrastructure analyses are still part of the project and are yet to come as part of that final urban services study later this fall. I sympathize. It's going to be really easy for everybody to jump ahead to those future conversations where we're talking about innovative and alternative visions that will be analyzed and then ultimately the policy choices to be discussed. But I ask council to do your best to try to stay in the moment and help us create this baseline first. So with that, I will pass it off to Sarah Horn for the presentation.
Thank you. Sorry, muted. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. It's my second time to be with you in a couple weeks, so it's a whirlwind tour, but I am glad to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see the presentation? Okay. So, as KJ said, we're here tonight to talk about the Area 3 Planning Reserve Urban Services Study. And again, I'm Sarah Horn. I'm a senior planner on the comp planning team. And I'm joined, as you know, by Christopher Johnson, our Planning and Development Comprehensive Planning Manager, and Brad Mueller, our Planning and Development Services Director. We also have members of our consultant team, AECOM, joining us, along with reps from various city departments. And while this project is being facilitated by the PNDS comp planning team, we're working in close collaboration with colleagues, many of whom are on the call tonight, from utilities, transportation, parks and recreation, police, fire, finance, the city managers, and the city attorney's office. And they've all been really instrumental in providing the information our consultant team needs to complete the study successfully. So the purpose of the study session item is threefold, and KJ talked a little bit about it, to review the service demand scenarios and associated assumptions, to provide information to you on the analyses planned for the urban services study, and to see if there's additional information that should be included in the final evaluations. For our agenda, I'll start with a review of the project background in the Area 3 Planning Reserve Service Area Expansion process, as Councilmember Wallach said, quite a mouthful. Then AECOM will talk about the urban services study in more detail, and they'll provide a quick summary of existing conditions and then talk about the service demand scenario development. And then I'll go over next steps and key questions. So in terms of project background, as you may know, in 2022, City Council identified the initiation of a baseline urban services study for the Area 3 Planning Reserve as a priority project. Their stated desire at that time was to complete the study prior to the next major update to the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And their reasoning was that it could be used to inform a decision on whether we should continue with the service area expansion process as part of that update. What is a service area expansion, you may be asking yourself? Well, it basically means making the city geographically larger by adding more area, which necessitates the provision of urban services to serve the subsequent increase in population. Now, urban services and related infrastructure and facilities are some of the things the city provides to support a strong community. The Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan states that adequate urban facilities and services are a prerequisite for new development. The plan defines 7 services that are being analyzed as part of this study. They're highlighted at the bottom of the slide, and AECOM will discuss them in more detail a bit later. The Area 3 Planning Reserve is the location where service area expansion is possible. The city's 1990 Area 3 planning project led to the creation of the reserve in 1993. It's highlighted with the pink location icon on the map on this slide. It's approximately 493 acres in size, and it's located just north of US 36. And it sits just outside the current service areas, which are areas 1 and 3, highlighted in light yellow and light gray on the map. Of those approximately 500 acres, the city owns approximately 220 of the total acres. About 270 acres is privately owned, and the U.S. Forest Service owns 5. The reserve was formalized and incorporated into the comp plan in 1995, and it's identified in the plan as the portion of Area 3 where, quote, the city maintains the option of expansion for future urban development in response to priority community needs that cannot be met within the existing service areas. So the process for service area expansion, that was also set in place at this time to ensure a methodical approach to potential expansion of the city. Then about 10 years after the planning reserve came online, the process in 2015 was revised to incorporate the urban services study as the first of 3 steps in the process. You can see all 3 steps on the slide, and this evening we're going to focus on step 1. So, per the comp plan, the purpose of this study, and again I quote, is to learn more about the feasibility and requirements to provide urban services to the area, and to understand potential phasing and logical areas of planning and potential expansion. It doesn't assume expansion is a foregone conclusion. Once the study is complete, you, council, can take one of 3 directions. The first option is to accept the study, and then planning board and council would hold public hearings to determine whether to move to step 2, which you see in the middle of the slide, the unmet community needs study. If authorized, staff will incorporate this study as part of the 2025 comp plan major update. Once that evaluation is complete, a determination would need to be made regarding step 3, which is a service area expansion plan. So that's your first option. The second option is to accept the study and decide not to proceed with step 2 at this time. Or you can choose not to accept the study and not to proceed with the process. If you choose either of the last two options, you still maintain the ability to revisit acceptance of the urban services study in the future. Basically, you can reinitiate the 3-step process at any time. So now back to step 1, the urban services study. This is a technical report, and as we've mentioned a couple of times, it doesn't make policy recommendations or plan for the future of the reserve. Its goals are to document existing conditions, the urban services and public infrastructure conditions, and to understand how they could be extended into the planning reserve. It also is meant to objectively analyze and describe the type and extent of services needed in the reserve under a range of service demand scenarios, and to develop an initial understanding of the potential impacts, costs, phasing, and funding of providing these services. And finally, to give decision makers, as KJ said earlier, baseline information to help determine if the city should continue to explore potential service area expansion. Policy decisions and the type of development that might be possible will be considered at a future time if council chooses to continue with this process. So to meet these study goals, staff settled on a 12-month timeline to complete the study. And to date, AECOM has completed tasks 1 and 2, the existing conditions research and the demand scenario development. They're now starting to evaluate these scenarios, and based on feedback from you tonight, they will work to complete the evaluations, hopefully by September. And then the study is expected to be finished by October of this year in advance of the comp plan update in accordance with the council request from 2022. And then finally, related to the process, our engagement strategy. As a technical study rather than a policy setting process, we're using the informed level on the city's engagement spectrum. And to date, staff have sent communications to council on 3 occasions, and we've shared each of these communications with Planning Board. We sent an IP memo last October to discuss the scope of work and schedule. In February of this year, the city manager's office sent a heads up to you to let you know that the project was proceeding on schedule. In April of this year, we sent an IP memo that described the initial existing conditions analysis, and we're here with you tonight. And then just one more thing, we do update the website regularly. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deanna Weber from AECOM to go into the actual study.
Thanks, Sarah. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. So let's dive into the existing conditions of the 493-acre parcel on the next slide. You'll begin to see that there's a number of parcels beginning with the City of Boulder parcel located at the yellow there further to the north, about 30 acres. There's also additional acreage of Boulder Housing Partners parcel in the orange there. There's a U.S. Forest Service in the dark green, and then the predominant acreage that the city controls is in the green area to the east. It's about 189 acres. The Boulder Valley Comp Plan identifies that as future parkland. Generally, the slope is pretty gentle. It's about 1.5% to 2.5% slope, gently sloping to the southeast there. And as you can see within the border, the dark black site boundary, there's a number of out parcels, privately held parcels that really present an opportunity for future development, but also a potential constraint since they're not controlled and owned by the city. Next slide. Within this process, as we begin to look at the urban services, we'll give a highlight here and dive into a little bit more detail in the next slides, but there's no existing city water lines, no wastewater infrastructure, and no stormwater master plan and floodplains that are currently mapped out. And as you know, we have identified limited transit services. The Boulder Fire Station, number 5, is the closest fire station, approximately half a mile away. And the closest police station is the North Foothills Police Annex, about 1.5 miles away. And as mentioned earlier, the 189 acres of the planning reserve projected to be used as future parkland. Next slide. When we think about the future planning considerations, there's limited transit service and roadway connections across US 36. Also limited or no city infrastructure currently serving this site. So additional analysis will really be required to understand some of the off-site improvements, including water and wastewater treatment capacity and infrastructure, as well as stormwater infrastructure, impact of floodplain on the development, and also wildlife and vegetation resources that are currently not part of this immediate study. Next slide. When we think about the service demand scenarios, to begin that process on the next slide, you'll begin to see here that we had an in-person scenario workshop with several city departments. We're really exploring land use and associated infrastructure. We're looking at relative scale, proportion, and dimensions and outcomes. In essence, we're really looking at the bookends of understanding, to scale approximately total number of population, as well as potential residential and non-residential uses. We've identified 3 different scenarios we'll share with you this evening, and they represent really a range of outcomes that are really not intended to be exact choices, but again, as I mentioned, those bookends of commercial gross floor area, jobs, residential units, and population, and that really helps us frame a rough order magnitude cost to really understand revenue impacts on city infrastructure and public service delivery. Next slide. So when we look at those assumptions, we are assuming we have a mix of uses, non-residential and residential uses. The tax generation revenue and finance data, I'm going to have Chris Brewer briefly mention a little bit about that information now. I'm not sure, Chris, if you're on mute there.
It could all happen. Apologies.
There we go. You're back. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Apologies. Part of our goal with the scope is to ultimately understand the land use scenarios in terms of their fiscal consequences to city general fund and enterprise funds. So ultimately being able to take the increase in housing units and built real estate and turn it into both gross and net change in property tax, sales tax revenue, and other utility revenue streams to provide that clear understanding of cost versus revenue for the project.
Thanks, Chris. In addition to looking at mix of uses, there's obviously parkland, and digging a little bit deeper into the residential, we've made the assumption of no large lot, single family residential anticipated in the project. It would be attached residential units. And we anticipate a mix of all types of housing units. Typically though, from the 8 dwelling units to an acre all the way up to approximately 50 dwelling units an acre, which would really start pushing really the limit of your height limit within the city. Certainly for transportation, looking carefully at multimodal paths, pedestrian and bike facilities, as well as I mentioned, water and wastewater demand based on the utility data, and then emergency services. So next slide starts to indicate what those alternatives look like. I'll go through all 3 of those and then show you a summary. As I mentioned earlier, these scenarios were developed based on workshop with city staff and various different departments. In this particular bookend, on the lower end, we're anticipating approximately about 4,300 housing units. Estimated population, you can see there, approximately about 9,000. And then the gross floor area of the non-residential, so it would be mixed commercial services, approximately 725,000. It's really, this scenario is about a mix of really nodes surrounded, mixed, a variety of commercial and residential nodes surrounding by a mix of residential densities. In the next scenario, scenario B, you'll see that we're increasing the density. We've got almost 1 million square feet of non-residential. This really focuses on mixed-use commercial residential development. It assumes that 100% of the commercial would be on the ground floor, we have approximately 5,300 dwelling units, which puts us at a population of about 11,600. And again, we're increasing the density on this to be approximately about 12 to 50 dwelling units per acre. So that's in that medium density attached residential. And you can see the parkland associated with each of these scenarios. And then on the next scenario, being the most dense, over 1 million square feet of gross floor area of commercial space. It's really mixed use commercial residential, assuming that the commercial space has approximately 3 levels of residential above the commercial on the ground floor. We've got about 6,700 dwelling units and about 4,500 for population. You can see again the density there, anywhere from 12 to 50 dwelling units per acre, and the associated parkland as well in this scenario. So this summary slide really looks at scenarios A, B, and C, really kind of framing the conversation. This helps us really begin to understand the total number of jobs, amount of housing units, what the population is, and parkland. And then this helps us then have our technical leads look at the infrastructure improvements associated on those types of densities. The next slide here talks a little bit about the preliminary takeaways with regard to our technical analysis that we've completed to date, and there's still more work to be done. First, regarding public water, we'll basically be looking at the water will need to be modeled in the future to determine the existing water supply and the proposed water supply needs. Certainly, preliminary evaluation has indicated on and off-site upgrades will be needed to the transmission and distribution infrastructure to basically increase the capacity that we need on the site itself. As for public infrastructure or the public sewers, we have projected wastewater flows that are being developed, and those flows or the loadings will be identified with the capacity to understand what increase in capacity is needed to accommodate the additional development. Stormwater infrastructure also will be needed. It would, if the project moves forward, it would be a new standalone stormwater plan that would be developed to allow really understanding the stormwater distribution and discharge for the future development. And as related to multimodal and transportation, preliminary analysis, suggests that CDOT may request some capacity improvements, but no detailed conversations have been had with CDOT at this time. So it's an assumption based on potential development, but certainly the opportunity to provide transit, pedestrian, bike improvements that would be required associated with the development. And on the next slide, Chris will help take us through some of the preliminary information from his interviews with fire and police.
Thank you, Deanna. So as part of our process, we met with staff associated with fire protection as well as police protection. Those interviews, we also ultimately vetted them with city manager as well, just for context. And I think on the fire side, there's at least an initial expectation that staff capacity is probably going to be sufficient. There is at least a sense that, if we add again 8 to 10 to 14,000 new residents, we would probably see an increase in ambulance and medical response. And the third bullet is that we did talk about questions related to wildfire risk and wildfire hardening. We understand that City Council is currently pondering changes to the code related to wildfire issues. So that's one thing that there's going to be an impact and we have to pay attention to. On the police side, we do see a couple of impacts. And again, part of this relates to the, expectations about the pace at which Area 3 builds out in the future, but obviously a faster pace would dictate maybe a more urgent need to think about police response in terms of just, adding that many residents and then adding staff. But we also think that there'll be a need to shift some of the boundaries in terms of police district boundaries, again, given the size of Area 3 and some of the density expectations. And then last but not least, we also talked about amenities. Obviously, the significant city purchase of land within, funded from Parks and Recreation Fund, the permanent fund. I think fundamentally, the clear policy guidance we've got is that, over the next several years, all the undeveloped parkland is going to be needed to meet expected city benchmarks for open space per resident. So the space will be needed. I think one of our big conversations during our process has been, what kind of park is it? What sort of different sorts of park options? So it becomes one of the key things that we've been thinking about carefully in this process, and we'll continue to think about as we move forward. As we go to the next slide, there are a number of ongoing work efforts right now that are in play. Number one, consequential conversations about what are the likely infrastructure improvements, both offsite and offsite. What do we think the order of magnitude construction costs are for those investments? And then ultimately putting those construction costs in context with what we think the additional tax revenues are going to be, both on-site and off-site. So for our purposes, that's going to be our intention is that be a pretty detailed conversation. So not only general fund, but enterprise funds, to understand both on a net and gross basis what the net position to the city would be over time based on how this may build out in the future. So a lot of work to do, but a solid basis that's been established at this point. Sarah, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. And before we get to the key questions for you, I'll just quickly go over next steps. The project team is also going to provide this same update to Planning Board on July 16th. And between July and October of this year, we'll continue to work with AECom to evaluate the 3 service demand scenarios to develop a more detailed analysis and understanding of the required improvements and fiscal impacts and costs. And then staff, we hope to review the final urban services study in October with you and Planning Board for review and acceptance respectively. And then with that, I'll just remind everyone the purpose of the study is to generate information that will be useful to you in the future. And so what would be really helpful for the AECom team and staff is to know if you have questions or comments about the assumptions we've used for the scenarios or the scenarios themselves. And if you have questions or comments on the urban services and infrastructure areas that will be analyzed. And with that, I will give it back to Council Member Wallach.
Thank you so
And
much.
actually, if I may, council member, just before going over and just frame a couple last comments, just as a reminder of the 3 scenarios, those really are presented not as alternatives per se or scenarios for kind of policy framing, but really just for analysis and to put a finer point on the more dense, so dense, denser, and densest. That represents the 50 dwelling units per acre represents what could be built as limited by the city's height limit, for example. So just wanted to provide that context as well as the context of the park area being park and not open space. I know there was some conflating of terms when we discussed that, but appreciate the opportunity to bring this forward tonight and look forward to your feedback and questions.
Okay, let's start with questions for staff and consultants. The first hand I see up is our mayor, followed by Tina. Mr. Mayor, you're up.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks so much, staff and AECom teams for this. It's been very enlightening in the memo and the presentation. Just a couple questions for you, and then maybe I'll have a little bit of feedback later on. One is, so in terms of the scenarios, that was helpful framing, Brad, but one thing that surprised me when I was reading the scenarios was the quantity of commercial space that was included in those. Because, decisions will be made in the future about if this area is developed, what mix of commercial and residential, but that seemed like a high starting point of 30 to 40 acres and 750,000 to 1 million square feet of commercial. So I'm just wondering why that was the baseline that was chosen as a minimum for the scenarios.
This is Chris. I would, or Sarah, I assume I think when we looked at the scenarios from a commercial standpoint, there was an expectation that given the scale of the residential footprint that we would see at least a neighborhood or community scale retail program included. So that might be, 150 to maybe 250,000 square feet. I think we also anticipated that within that footprint or that acreage, you would also consider maybe whether it be office flex, office showroom type development. So there was at least a consideration for some level of employment oriented uses within that program. So we wanted to make sure we had allowed for it. And then obviously some of that retail would also be in a mixed use environment. So retail at street level with residential above. So I think a certain amount of it was judgment based on experience of what we've seen elsewhere as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The only thing I'd add to that is, certainly, it's a flexible number in terms of the total commercial gross square feet. When we look at first floor out of mixed use to be commercial, when we look at the carrying capacity of the land, that's one scenario of how we've looked at it as well. And then the other scenario really looks at how can we minimize trips and create an opportunity where you could maybe live or work close to where you also shop and frequent. So that's one of the strategies, is to minimize the number of trips associated with vehicle travel as well.
Very good. And Mark, do you mind if I just respond to that while I've got the floor?
Yes, go ahead.
So just that's helpful to understand. And I guess I would just put out there, I'm actually looking out my window at the office space across from my house where I officed for 20 years. So like a big believer in that kind of mixed use, being able to work where you live. But just, I guess my thought would be the 750,000 to $1 million seems to incorporate maybe some employment centers above and beyond neighborhoods serving retail and opportunities to work in small offices within your neighborhood. So just wondering if that's the appropriate minimum for us to start with. And then do you have a sense of, like, would the numbers drastically change if that number were more like 350,000 square feet of commercial, then that went to residential instead, or would that mess with all of your assumptions, or would the larger analysis still work out?
I think in general terms, the analysis remains flexible. I think, again, part of the, since the scope didn't presume an actual market study to define what the market would require, I think one of our policy goals with the fiscal impact study is to provide some sense of, for every new square foot of space you add, there will probably be a shift in the market. So some of the sales will shift from one store to another. So we always want to think about the net sales tax benefit versus the gross benefit. So to simply answer your question, I think obviously we can adjust the scenarios and reduce the amount of commercial space. Wouldn't be a problem if it needed to happen.
Very good. Appreciate that. And
Yeah.
My one other one, Allie Rhodes, are you on the call here? I think I see you.
She is. She was having
There she
trouble
is.
with her internet, but she's here.
Hey folks, Allie Rhodes, Director of Parks and Recreation.
Thanks for responding, Allie. I just wonder if you might address that. There's been some discussion about the level of park services kind of necessary, and a significant percentage right now that this area is owned by the Parks Department. We chatted about this a little bit offline a couple of days ago. Is there some potential flexibility to work in a robust parks system in this neighborhood, but not necessarily have all 190 acres go specifically to parks uses?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer for the full council a little bit the way that I shared with Aaron when we spoke the other day. When that policy question comes to council, we're going to provide a lot of information to help you make that decision. And you're going to want to look at three things. You're going to want to look at neighborhood parks. So depending on the mix of residential that you have, the comp plan requires neighborhood parks, and it specifically calls out developed parkland because there is a difference between passive open space and what can happen in developed parkland. So there is a standard in the comp plan that you have a neighborhood park of at least 5 acres within a half mile of every residential unit. Now, you're going to want to look at that thoughtfully, because if it's a really dense area, we would suggest you'd want a bigger neighborhood park, because it's going to need to be everybody's backyard and facilitate the children playing and dogs walking and connecting that might happen in single family homes. So that's one consideration. You'll also want to look at that this is a large swath of parkland Regional parks are one of our classifications where neighborhood parks are for that close to home neighborhood use. Regional parks serve the entire community, and they're the limited places where you can have large gatherings. They have parking and all the amenities that can associate them. Existing regional parks are Valmont City Park, the Flatirons Golf Course, and the Boulder Reservoir. And so you can see how each has unique needs that are met only at that site and not anywhere else in the community. The third thing you want to consider, and to Mark Aaron's point, is the system. So one of the things that park systems measure themselves around is acres per capita. And that's just talking about, do you have enough green space for people? It doesn't consider where it is, density of the housing around it, but acres per capita, we're right around median, according to national benchmarks and the Trust for Public Land benchmarks. Currently, we would want to develop every single acre that is not developed at Foothills Community Park, Valmont City Park, and at Area 3 to maintain that median. And so a policy question before council will be is, do we want to maintain that acres per service capita? And then the other question will be, does it all have to be met there? I would suggest there's other places in the system. So for example, City Council approved a purchase of land in Area 2 at Hogan Pancoast with parkland a potential use. That's 20 acres. And so if that were to become park acreage, that adjusts the calculus. So again, when that policy question comes to council, I think you're going to want to be very, very thoughtful about it, given the price of land. And I'll be the first to tell you about the value of parkland, but we're going to do everything we can to give you information to make a really good decision when that time comes.
Thanks, Sally. That's incredibly helpful. And to be clear, we very much want a very healthy park system in this area and citywide. So no saying anything against that, but just wanted to see what the lay of the land might be for that. That's all my questions. I'll have a couple comments later. Thank you.
Next up is Councilmember Marquis, followed by Councilmember Folkerts and Councilmember Shushard.
Okay, thank you so much for all the information. My first question is just when we think about the total amount of water with new development, do we have any kind of limit on how much development we can using the water we have? Or is there, and I know there's a lot of water analysis, but what I'm getting at more isn't how to get our existing water to and then the sewage out of the area, but just to understand, do we need to get a new water resource to facilitate this development? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I will certainly defer to our colleagues in utilities. And I see Kim Hutton's popped on screen, who oversees the water supply side of things. So hopefully Kim can provide some insight on that.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, council members. My name is Kim Hutton. I'm the Water Resources Manager. So one of the things that we do in water resources and utilities is look at sort of long-term water supply planning, and we don't necessarily have a sort of a carrying capacity study for how much we can build out under the existing water supply. The way that we analyze our system is we look at what the projected build out, demands are, if I can use the term build out. And from there, we do an analysis of, are we able to reliably meet those projected build out demands? And so as part of this analysis, what we will be doing is adding this additional demand onto our system, and then doing an analysis there to see, can we reliably meet those demands? And the criteria for reliable is based on some level of service goals that were adopted by City Council a number of decades ago, actually, and they speak to the frequency with which we can implement water use restrictions. So that is a policy consideration as well, the level of service or reliability criteria that may come up in the future with council as well.
Okay, can I ask a follow-up question, Mark? Or
Yes.
Councilmember Wallach? Does our long-term modeling include sort of scenarios where there's drastic changes in the water supply? Largely downward would be my guess. Do we plan out that far, or how do we look at those different scenarios?
Yes. So one thing that we are doing in terms of, I think what will be the most significant impact on our ability to serve is climate change. And so we are modeling a variety of climate change scenarios. And under some of the climate change scenarios, they range from, all of them are warmer, some of them are much hotter, but actually they kind of range from being wetter to drier. And so we are seeing in some of those hotter and drier scenarios that the outdoor demands will increase because it's drier, hotter, and the available supply from precipitation will decrease. So that's kind of like a double, whammy on our ability to serve.
Okay, thanks. And then my other question, which is not related to water, is do the people who own the land, that's obviously not the parkland, are they engaged in this process, or do we wonder what they're curious about developing in this area?
So go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, no, you can go ahead, Chris. I was just gonna say, I think that we haven't quite gotten there at this point in the study, but Chris, you.
I think our scope of services, well, Deanna will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe our scope of services did not expect that we reaching out to the property owners. I think there would come a point where you would definitely want to reach out to them to understand their interests. I think one of our big strategic questions is, how does this area actually develop? Do you have multiple developers, a master developer? What's the role of the city? Like, these become, again, not questions for today, but questions down the road.
Yeah,
Okay.
and just
Yeah, and I'll
just-
go ahead, Sarah. Yeah,
just to
go ahead.
piggyback off that, Councilwoman Marquez, it would really probably happen in step 3 of this process. And just so you know, we have looked it up, and there are several it's not like there are just 2 property owners or 3. There are quite a few private property owners in the area.
Okay, thanks so much. That's all I have for now.
Okay, before I turn to Councilmember Focus, Councilmember Adams, did you have your hand up? It wasn't clear to me. Well, forgive me for that. I did not pick it up. I will catch you right after Councilmember Shuchar, if that's all right with you.
No, you won't. I actually was before them, so I'm gonna, yeah. If y'all don't mind, I would like to take my turn.
Take your turn.
now. Thank you so much. The brown hand is hard to see, alas. I have several questions, so thank you so much for this opportunity. This is my first opportunity to ever be involved in anything like this, and it's one of the reasons why I ran for office. So, and the first one is just going to be, I'm curious what lessons have been applied from the previous planning efforts that are now being considered in this plan as it relates to transportation. Like, how are we innovating? How are we, again, we know that we are humidifying and desertifying. And so I'm just kind of wondering where the innovations are, what are the lessons that we've learned, and how are they being applied now, particularly around climate, as you can imagine. But I did have curiosities as I'm coming on and just getting a little bit more history on that. So that's just in your framing. I'm curious about that. I also had questions about, I'd say the biggest question I have is just what the rationale was for the selection of Inform as it relates to our community engagement framework. As some of you may know, our community engagement spectrum ranges, and it starts with Inform, which is the lowest level of engagement that you can make with our community is Inform. And that's just providing the public with a balanced and objective information to assist them in understanding the problem, alternatives, and opportunities. And the promise that we make to the public is just to keep them informed. I didn't run to keep people informed. I ran because I really wanted people to be deeply consulted and involved and create a more collaboratory experience. And so I am concerned that Inform, the lowest level of engagement that we could have for a whole new neighborhood, a whole new part of our community, is concerning. It's especially concerning because when I look at our boards and commissions, which we've had conversations around, even our council, our staff, the consultants that we're working with, all exceptional, but not necessarily representative of all of the perspectives that we have in our community and the expertise and experiences that we have in our community. And so I'm just curious of the rationale and if there are opportunities to, at the very least, move to stage 2, which is consult, to obtain public feedback on public analysis, alternatives, and or decisions. And that the public promise from us is that we not only keep them informed, but we listen to and acknowledge their concerns and aspirations. So again, I suspect that this type of engagement may be allowed or authorized later on in the process. But I urge us, this is where the most powerful decisions are being made. And so this is where, this is the place where marginalized voices and others have not had an opportunity to meaningfully participate. And so I just am really curious about the rationale with that. I have three more things. I agree with Mark's hotline on the fiscal note. It's clear to me that you all have numbers because you've referenced a couple of them. And so I'm just hopeful that we can get more information, because with the lack of that fiscal information, it's hard to put these numbers into context. And so again, I just want to continuously, I will echo it until I see them. And I know that they are on the way. But again and again and again, we need them. And so I want to urge us not to look for perfection in what those fiscal notes can look like, but really maybe we can have some iterative processes or rollout of the grain size so that at the very least we have some fiscal anchors to keep us grounded. The employment assumptions. So we know that there's going to be some, experts in employment have informed many that we can anticipate significant changes in employment over the next 10 to 15 years related to generative AI. I've heard things anywhere from 30 to 40% across industry and across socioeconomic. And so I'm just curious what the formula or considerations in the employment section was. And then lastly, because I don't only care about housing and jobs for people, but I'm also thinking about all of the living organisms that are needed for humans to thrive. And that includes our wildlife. So I'm curious about the wildlife impacts and the analyses there. So those are my questions, and I look forward to receiving just some of that thought and responses and any questions that you may. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Adams, for those questions. Maybe to touch on some and all of them together, I do want to affirm what you were confirming, which is you're right. When this comes to you as a final study, it will have the numbers. The fiscal numbers will be a little hard to give in real terms because we're talking about a unknown build out scenario, but certainly the intention behind your point is well understood, and also frankly the whole intention of this. And we very much share your expectation and anticipation that the public will need to be involved in a level beyond just informing after this step, so the steps 2 and 3. And this is exactly the information provided for you as council, so that you can make and the public can start to make those kind of qualitative values-based kind of conversations. To put an example on it, we want to make sure that you've got the information that if 100 homes meant that a $1 million pipeline had to go in, but 150 homes meant that a $600 million pipeline went in, just those order of magnitudes of differences under the scenarios, we want to make sure that that's some baseline information that you have going into it. We anticipate that there will be innovation brought both to from the participating public and yourselves as council as we engage in that question of need, and then if the decision is made by council in step 2 for need, in step 3 to actually innovate what that land use mix and nature is. To your question about the employment and the employment assumptions, I would turn to somebody from AECOM to maybe articulate what the baseline assumptions were for employment behind these models.
So in simple terms, we're trying to be very sensitive to, the impact of hybrid and remote work to come up with, defendable assumptions for square feet per employee based on the type of use. I think, again, since this is a conceptual level study, we're talking ultimately about non-residential space. So there could be a broad type set of jobs that we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I could build on that a little bit too, Chris. Just that through in previous comprehensive planning processes, and certainly as we move forward into the next update, starting before the end of the year, we have assumptions based on a variety of different employment types and the number of square feet per employee that go into our land use projections. We're in the process of actually revising, updating those based on more recent data so that we can start to reflect and understand the impacts of COVID and hybrid work now. So all of those assumptions are continuing to be, revised and updated as to the best of our ability through additional studies by consultants and others. And as far as your comment too, the impacts of AI and things like that, quite honestly, I don't think we've thought quite that far ahead to, try to make those assumptions. I'm just not sure if we have a good enough understanding yet to make those adjustments.
Okay. And again, it is the job loss that is being anticipated by generative AI. And so I look forward in the next iteration to get some more detailed information. And just in general, I would love to know what assumptions are being used to inform, right? I think that's absolutely critical. So this is very helpful, Christopher. So thank you so much for that additional layer, and Chris and Christopher for that. Wildlife impacts?
Yeah, I can touch on that one as well. So, as this is really a study that's focused on those 7 urban services that are defined within the comprehensive plan,
Okay.
we have not taken a close look at wildlife impacts. One thing I will note that though is that when the planning reserve was established in 1993, there was a study of all the Area 3 lands around the city, and this was an area that was identified as having sort of the least limitations related to open space quality, wildlife impacts, floodplain impacts, that type of thing. So I would say at a very sort of macro level, this area probably has some fairly minor, wildlife considerations, but certainly as we move forward and ultimately if this moves forward into a much more detailed expansion plan, those additional studies would absolutely be part of those conversations, just not right now.
And I guess I'm just going to have a chat with you in a minute, but that's where I'm looking for the innovations, right? When I'm talking about what innovations are we using now to, inform, to be better planners, right? And so I guess where I'm saying is, to me, we should be considering how wildlife now, right? It's not humans first. We know what happens when we do humans first. And so I'm just hopeful that we can get into a deeper balance. I know this is question time, but I just wanted to speak to that. Thank you very much. You've answered all my questions. I added 2 more. Community center. Was that a consideration in there? A community center or some kind of, I saw residential, commercial. I was curious if community center was something that was on your radar screen, and then also indigenous voice.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Brent.
I was going to speak to the first one. Maybe Christopher, you can to the second, but community centers and really all non-residential uses are encompassed in that earliest category that came up in the discussion with the mayor. So the retail and commercial, just to articulate and put a finer point on it, is all of those kind of other uses: institutional, places of worship, community gathering spaces, private and public. So those are encapsulated.
Yeah, and again, I just offer that, I'm hopeful that we can be more explicit around that, specifically the community center and community space. I know that's something that has been pretty consistent in something we don't have in any part of our community. And so I'm grateful I asked that clarifying question. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, Councilwoman Adams, I just want to mention too that parkland can include community facilities. So especially our policy currently is that is set for regional park, so that could entertain a community center.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Sarah.
Mhm.
And if I'll touch on your question around Indigenous voice. So we haven't specifically, reached out or considered that as part of this process, because we made the choice to stay at that informed level, because we are focused on the infrastructure component and the fiscal impacts. I will say that as we've started have more conversations around the scope and engagement strategy for the comprehensive plan update, which would incorporate, consideration of policies around this particular location. We've had some conversations already with Philip Yates, who and Pam Davis, who are our liaisons to the Indigenous working groups about how we can incorporate Indigenous voice into the comp plan process. So that is definitely something on the radar for that much bigger community engagement process.
And any land back considerations?
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And then I'm sorry, I just want to offer one more thing, Councilwoman Adams, that in the second phase, if, as I said earlier, this isn't a foregone conclusion that this Area 3 will be developed. So that's something to think about. And when the community is involved in step 2, that will be a time when some of these conversations like you're talking about, it will be very appropriate to have those and to see what the community is interested in and if there are unmet needs. So just so you know, if you keep deciding to move forward, those will occur in the next step.
Good.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Adams, again, I'm sorry, I did not see your hand up, but my apologies for that. Councilmember Folkerts, Shushard, Weiner, and Spear. Questions, please.
Thank you, Mark. So I just wanted to echo something Sarah said real quick. I think it's definitely not a foregone conclusion what we're going to do here. I think there's still a lot of thinking to go into this. In terms of questions, I guess I have quite a few. At the beginning, we were talking about orders of magnitude and how this is really about understanding orders of magnitude. But when I look at kind of these different scenarios, it's not clear to me that these different scenarios are orders of magnitude different. It seems like there's a pretty linear relationship between sort of the different things that are being weighed in each scenario. And so I'm curious why we're looking sort of just at essentially residential square footage and commercial square footage as the basis for looking for different scenarios, as opposed to things like, what kind of construction we might envision. If this is an eco village versus if this is 1950s construction versus this is code compliant with today's construction, these are all going to have huge impacts on what kind of how they impact our infrastructure needs, potentially more than the spread I see in terms of residential units and square footage of commercial space.
So if I might just really quickly ask for a little bit clarification. So it sounds like your question is well, maybe it's twofold in terms of the actual sort of spread of densities, numbers of units, assumptions around non-residential versus residential. But then there's a second component that's based on the sort of type of construction or the sort of energy codes or other codes that would potentially be part of that would have an impact on water use. energy use, that type of thing. Am I understanding that correctly?
I guess I would be more interested in knowing, do we expect to find a linear relationship between kind of the residential square footage and the commercial square footage? And can we look at other things besides those things that have a linear relationship to each other when we're looking at different scenarios?
Sure. Well, I think so. Basically, we made some assumptions around what would be sort of an appropriate or an expected minimum amount of density in the planning reserve. So we look to the holiday neighborhood as a good comparable within the city that that we understand. We kind of have a sense of what that feels like. That felt like if the city was to embark upon extending infrastructure and costs related to that to expand into the planning reserve, we didn't feel like kind of large lot rural residential single family dwellings was an appropriate level of density. So that's why we set our lower baseline at holiday neighborhood densities in general. Um, as we got to the other end of the spectrum, as we mentioned, the height limit and other existing restrictions really kind of put the brakes on those higher levels of density that were really 50 units an acre is about as far as we could go. And so then that left us with those two kind of larger bookends, but then we also wanted to be able to describe something that was a bit more in the center of that. One alternative that we did not prepare that we talked about but just didn't feel like was maybe a realistic or worthwhile solution or scenario to evaluate was something that was much higher on the non-residential side, so really more of an employment center, a warehousing district, like those kinds of uses as opposed to residential. First of all, we're not entirely sure that there's that much demand or need for that, but also just looking at the site and its location, and understanding kind of the direction of council through other planning processes. That's why we focused on a more heavily, residential set of scenarios.
Okay. I don't really think that answered my question, but I can move on. So what kind of assumption are we making for the amount of utilities that we're thinking about these residential or commercial floor areas are using? Like, are we basing that on averages of our current community or what our current code would require or what a new potential code could require?
Yes, we're using existing data, and certainly, folks from our either transportation or utilities departments can chime in if I veer off course here. But yes, we're using existing data, looking at some of our existing use characteristics, also using best practices from and other comparables from other municipalities, that kind of thing. But we haven't necessarily projected forward to new types of codes or new limitations or those kinds of alternative solutions. We're really trying to establish this really just this kind of baseline understanding under some fairly traditional assumptions, knowing that in the future we may have to innovate and have to mitigate some of those impacts in order to address some of the resulting expansion of infrastructure, other kinds of effects if development was to move forward in the planning reserve. So that's why we're staying fairly traditional at this point, so that we have something to measure against going forward.
Okay. And in terms of costs, I think one of the things I would also be interested in understanding, because I know that there is a relationship between density and tax base. So while having additional units might create more upfront cost, there is also likely to be lower maintenance costs over time. So having an idea of, or distributed for the tax base, it's more cost effective for the city to maintain. Is that something we can include in this framework?
Chris,
An idea of how that would work?
Yeah, Chris, I'll
Oh.
defer to you on that.
Our expectation for the fiscal analysis is that we will be able to discern a difference in general fund impact based on different levels of density. So a more dense project should yield slightly lower costs than a lower density project. So that's something we're focusing on in the fiscal impact study to make sure that we can delineate that.
Could we also see how a higher percentage or lower percentage of residential might impact that?
Yep, that's part of the plan.
And would looking at different types of construction, like trying to, if this was a cutting edge eco district, is that possible in terms of what could be included in this?
So I think for this scope of work, our focus is going to be on, we're going to work with our cost estimating team to make and consult with city staff to be clear on what the expectations for building in this, wildfire prone area would be. So we want to make sure that at minimum we have the appropriate construction standards to get at that. I think beyond that, we would have to, talk with city staff and ultimately work with you in future phases to clarify those alternatives and how we would cost them correctly. If they are too non-traditional or too, like if there aren't solid benchmarks that allow us to predict it.
I mean, this kind of idea is pretty common. I don't know, 10 years ago studied eco districts in Europe and the redevelopments that were happening there. And, the kinds of things they're pushing are much farther than what seems to be suggested by this study. So it's not like cutting edge, like.
Totally agree with you. I think in the near term, just given construction costs the way they've been, I think we're just trying to make sure that we can deliver a clear construction cost against a clear type of construction, just to be as straightforward as possible. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, though.
I understand from the utilities themselves, the technology and, not wanting to guess a lot there, but those things seem like they would mostly impact the amount of utility and not the construction of it. So the cost should be not significantly harder to calculate.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've been talking a lot about geothermal applications in the last 6 months, so probably the best thing we can do is work with staff to clarify some of these alternative technologies and think about how we can approach them for the study.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, before I call upon our last three council members, we are running substantially behind our schedule on this, so I would urge you to be as concise and pithy as you can, so that we can move into the comment section, which we have not even begun. So, Council Member Shuhard, Council Member Weiner, and Council Member Spear in that order.
Thank you. Thanks, Deanna and team. I have a couple-ish of questions. I saw the subheader on multimodal transportation and was thinking, well, this would be a good place to look for how we're going to double down on transit service and expand our bikeway network. But what really jumped out was that preliminary analysis suggests that we may need to widen the highway. And I know it's preliminary, but I'm curious if you could say more about that, about I guess the bookends of what that means as far as what lengths or widths we're talking about. And if we know anything about like what would actually trigger that, and if we could manage this strictly to avoid an outcome where we're widening highways.
Yeah, I can pop in. I see Natalie and Garrett also chiming in, and I'll just provide a little bit of real quick, introductory remarks. Let Garrett really take this, but the intention and really those preliminary types of analyses is based on these traditional assumptions and what a typical outcome would be if you're adding that level of density, if you're adding that much population and the vehicle trips associated with that. The likely outcome would be to consider expansion of the road. Now, that again is just a baseline, understanding and something that we can then use to say and have future conversations around, well, if we don't want to expand the road, what are the options that we can do, and what are the things that we can do to mitigate that? I'll pass it to Garrett from there.
Good evening, Council. My name is Garrett Slater. I'm the Capital Projects Manager for the Transportation and Mobility Department. And so a few thoughts about the question from Councilmember Schuchard. The first would be that we would want to take a look at a model that was used comparable to the CU South annexation, where we take an analysis in the next phase of work to examine the available capacity in the system, and then generate a trip budget within which we would identify what additional impact we could create to the system within our existing infrastructure. And then from there, anything above that, we would use a host of transportation demand management solutions and strategies to mitigate the impact that the land use would create to the existing system. And of course, that would entail a whole host of the traditional approaches that are identified in our transportation master plan, such as bicycling infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, transit use, and also being mindful of some of the commentary that's been heard this evening, thinking about future technologies and transportation network carriers, such as the lift line and some of the technologies that we're using in place today, thinking about how to accommodate that, would all be part of the suite of solutions that we would take a look at. And I also want to, because this is directly adjacent to Highway 36, it's important to note that's a CDOT facility. CDOT has demonstrated the willingness to be consistent in transportation vision with the city's approaches on Arapahoe and CO7, as well as other corridors that are part of the city. And they've been a great partner with us as we look to convert general purpose lanes to transit lanes, and expect that CDOT would continue to be a really great partner with us in the future as we look at planning area 3. And so I don't expect that they would take a hard line approach to that traditional methodology, but look to be a willing partner with us as we look to explore ways to mitigate the impacts to the system.
Thanks. That's all I have. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Councilmember Weiner, you're up.
Okay. My biggest question is I am kind of looking for a magic density number that doesn't put too much stress on our system with flooding and strapping our resources, that wouldn't put stress on us cost-wise, and would also give us some middle income housing, right? Which I know that's not what we're talking about today. But my question is I'm hoping, and is it possible for when we get this, as we go forward, would you be able to give us like some sort of a tipping point where, let's say, to Ryan's point, we would at this density we would need to widen the road, but if you just stay there, we won't. Or at this density, it would have less environmental impacts, water impacts, but if you stay here, you won't. So we can make good decisions when it comes to density. That's my first question. So in other words, can there be tipping points where you
Absolutely, and that really is the purpose of the study, and ultimately the financial analysis and better understanding. We use these scenarios to generate what those impacts are going to be. Then we can analyze the financial component to that. Through that information, that's going to be able to provide all of you and the community a better understanding of where those tipping points are, whether it be related to density or the type of use or the type of infrastructure. We're just not quite there yet.
Okay, great.
And if I can,
yeah, go ahead.
If I can piggyback on that too, and this may sound obvious, so I don't mean for it to be, but there is no expectation that a scenario A, B, or C would ever actually get built out in the future, right? It's an order of magnitude model that again gives council the ability to just say, yes, we'd envision if you determine the needs is there as step 2. In step 3, to be able to say, well, okay, let's do this, but we know that because of this study that was done a year ago, 2 years ago, that if we do this much more, to your point, we're going to have to add a road, or we're going to have to build a whole new water treatment plant, for example. So so that really is how this is a document that will inform those discussions, the discussions with the public, and also our own use in being able to help provide you better information for these kind of policy questions in the future.
Okay, great. And my second question has to do with me going over some of the information packets and having a question there. Give me 1 second to just pull it up. Talk amongst yourselves for just 1 second. Just kidding. So it says it references 1977, and it says Area 3 was defined in 1977 to not accommodate urban development so that the rural character could be preserved and protected. Are we still trying to do that, or is I'm wondering if there's a spirit of Area 3 Planning Reserve that we should know about, since most of us haven't been around that long?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we will get into a lot more details about areas 1, 2, and 3 as part of the comp plan update coming up. But you're correct. So Area 3 was that whole planning area concept was established in 1977. That created areas 1, 2, and 3. Originally, the Area 3 is intended to and provides for that rural preservation, essentially the green belt around the city that separates Boulder from our other communities in the county. In 1993, actually started in 1990, I think it was adopted then in 1993, was an Area 3 study that looked at all those Area 3 locations around the city and determined if there was an area where the city wanted to maintain an option for expansion in the future. That is how the planning reserve came to be. So by identifying the planning reserve, it really kind of reinforced the notion of the rest of Area 3 as rural preservation, and then the planning reserve is that one other additional area where the city could potentially expand.
Because planning reserve has such a bucolic sound, and so when I saw mega density, I was like, that just doesn't sound like a Area 3 planning reserve. Thank you. That's all my questions for now.
Okay, last up is Mayor Pro Tem Spear, and then I will have one question myself.
Thank you. And is it okay? My last question kind of leads into one comment. May I just blend those, or do you want me to wait?
You better blend them because our comment section is going to be brief indeed.
All right, I will do that then. So first question, I'm just looking for, quick, it's not a long question. What do you anticipate being the timeline for steps 2 and 3? So in other words, if this moves forward, when would development start, and when would we have a fully functioning neighborhood? Just again, ballpark kinds of things on the timeline.
Councilwoman Spear, I think that step 2 would start with the comprehensive planning process, and then we would move through that, and then there would be public hearings after that, and then we could move to the service area expansion process. But to be quite honest, we would probably see nothing at least until the end of the decade.
Yep. So 2030 for sort of development, and just kind of timeline for fully functioning neighborhood, 2050 beyond.
Yeah, probably. I mean, around that. Yeah. I mean, it would take that long to build out. And I just for a point of clarification, I just, want to make sure these are really great questions in terms of this analysis right now. It's kind of an order of magnitude to say we might need a few pipes, or we might need an entire new water treatment plant. So these are the things in front of you. And then depending on that, you might say, we don't want to do this at all, or let's keep moving forward. But it's a very 30,000 level kind of analysis. So just for everyone to keep that in mind. And yes, it would take a long time.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. And that's what, just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. And just 30,000 foot timeline is what I was looking for. How do we think about and incorporate into some of this some of the study, the changes that are underway now that will influence the services needs in the future. So the assumptions, for example, around energy use, water use, those won't necessarily be the same as we're making more energy efficient buildings, as we are increasing our drought resistant landscape and increasing absorbent landscape, as we are, maybe needing more personnel for more fires and floods and things, as we're increasing multimodal transportation. We don't need quite as much, we don't need to plan for quite as much car traffic, for example. So I guess I don't really have a good sense of how we're incorporating some of that, the changes and innovations that are happening now into thinking about this, especially given the timeline that we're looking at is so far out.
Yeah, I mean, if I might just offer, we're doing the best we can, right? We're doing the best we can with the information that we have from, existing conditions and uses that are, providing, using water that we can measure and we can understand, what the consumption looks like. We can certainly make some assumptions around kind of future adjustments and things like that, and look at trends and try to anticipate, but we've been a little bit cautious about doing that because we really want to try to establish this baseline number of point in time. Here's where we are. I will say this is very much not the only analysis that will occur if this process continues forward. So if we get to the service area expansion plan process, there will need to be a number of additional studies and analyses done to really dig into that. And then even if that is accepted and adopted, then individual properties would need to go through annexation process. There's development review. All of those things are going to require traffic studies and, stormwater and all the other kind of engineering components to that. So again, we're doing the best we can with the information that we have today, and hopefully that is sufficient and acceptable at this moment in time.
Yeah, no, thank you. And sorry, I don't mean to, be pushing you harder. I'm just trying to think about how we make these decisions, even
Sure.
as policymakers. So my other question is just, and it's okay again, if this isn't happening right now, it may come later, but just thinking about the regional housing needs assessment that's been going on, and some of the information that we have from the state demographer's office in terms of what population projections are looking like 25 years into the future in terms of age distribution and household size and all those kinds of things. Does that, or will that, I guess, factor into some of our decision making as well, or some of the analysis?
I would say it won't enter into the analysis as much right now, unless Chris, I saw you come off mute, unless there's something kind of related to some of the financial components. But as far as like the specific types of housing and all of those kinds of things, that would be part of those future needs conversations and ultimately an expansion plan to better understand that.
I will just briefly add that the basic premise of a denser and densest scenario does account, though, for the fact that the basic policy environment around housing is captured. So hence the comment Christopher made earlier about there's no single family detached, large lot development in a scenario. So hopefully that reinforces it, just at least at the very basic level.
Okay, thank you. And just kind of going into my comments, what I've heard some of my colleagues say tonight and what I'm kind of taking away from this too is it would be really helpful to have just a list of kind of the assumptions that are being made, what kinds of modeling is being factored in. Like I, heard about climate modeling as it relates to water availability and use and things too, but just some of these assumptions that are in there. Because I think that is what I am most interested in knowing for kind of future as we move forward with this work, if we choose to. What are those things that are being taken into account? Are they all the things that feel in this moment like they're the things that are going to, or the issues that are going to impact the kinds of decisions that we're making as we move forward? So just be nice to have that kind of clarified in a list or something that we can look to and then let you know. Then we're not saying, hey, have you considered this and this and this, but rather be able to tell you if there's anything in there that feels like it may be missing. I don't need to know what exact model or anything is being used, but just the types of things that we are using to predict what we're going to need in the future would be helpful. So, but thank you so much for all this work. I really appreciate it. It's fun to see this starting to come together a little bit after all the work that everybody has been doing on it for so long. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask my one question and then I will turn it over for the briefest and most incisive comments possible, as many of our questions have already verged on commentary, and we are just about out of time. My one question is, I have argued in my hotline that if we want to see a great deal of affordable and or middle market housing developed at this site, we're going to need to use government-owned land to do it. Is it possible to do a model that at least explores the feasibility and the costs of utilizing the 200 acres that we own for that purpose? Would anybody like to take that on? That was a question.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, KJ. Otherwise, I can speak to it.
Yeah, I don't,
Go
Brad,
ahead.
you wanted to
Yeah.
do it? Okay, yeah, no, I think, yeah, thank you for the request, Councilmember. I do think that is something that we could certainly explore as an additional, scenario. We were cautious about, making assumptions without guidance from council on to do that, but if that is certainly your wishes, we can build that in, and we can speak with AECOM just to make sure we've got scope and budget to be able to do that.
That's my request, and it's the end of my questions. Councilmember Folkerts?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a really interesting point, and I would vote for also understanding that better. I'm not going to sugarcoat my opinions on the rest of this. I am fairly frustrated. I think it's so problematic to be looking at the redevelopment of this area with only the baselines of sort of the average of the existing construction standards. I think if we were to develop it that way, that would represent a huge failure. And in order to make a decision about how we move forward with this, I think we really need to understand how we can reduce some of these infrastructure costs by taking things by making small changes. One of my big ones is going to be stormwater management. I think in the memo there was a suggestion that we could tie sites together because sites are small and stormwater is going to be an issue. But this is one of the only cities that requires us to deal with stormwater in the way that it does. Typically, you can store stormwater underground, and most properties are capable of managing the entirety of their stormwater on site. So the idea that, and that's going to have a huge impact on the kind of infrastructure that would be needed. So without at least taking a cursory glance at what kind of basic changes might allow us to do, I think we don't really have the information we need to really understand what a development of this area would require in terms of infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to our very time efficient Mayor Brockett.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much, everybody. Just to follow up on my previous question about the commercial space, just would encourage you as a comment to look at a baseline there that includes neighborhoods serving retail and local jobs for people who live there, but doesn't include this as an employment center, a new employment center in and of itself. So, which I'm guessing is less than the 750,000 square foot. But that's my comment on that side. And then on the transportation side, I was glad to see you flagging the multimodal and the transit improvements there. As you all know, transit is not entirely in our hands, right? Since we have to work with RTD on these things. but I think it's still critically important that we get transit up here. So that's a kind of delicate balance to strike. But this is one where I really hope that we can not just apply formulas. And I think you're hearing that from a number of different people in a number of different ways, which I think makes this challenging, but also, there would be creative ways to get people across the highway, and there would be creative ways to get paratransit in, and or micromobility and things like that in ways that would not require us to just that where a formula might say widen the highway, but how could we spend a similar amount of money and do multimodal improvements that would not require us to widen the highway? So I know we're making this a little bit challenging for you all, but I think if we're thinking some of this, like I feel like the wastewater pipeline is really just a kind of a formula driven, but if we can be thinking about how innovative approaches might not lead us to a formula approach for some of the other calculations, I think we would benefit from that. So thanks again for all the amazing work and looking forward to the next stages on this.
And last, as I see it, is laser focused council member Shuhard.
Thank you. I have 5 laser focus points. Number 1, 2 of the basic premises I am hearing is that we need more housing of the right kind, and we're willing to spend considerable effort to develop new land to get it. And I would like to see, as we go with future analysis, additional consideration of the underused area within the city that could be used for infill to fulfill those purposes, especially parking lots and other paved surfaces where creative arrangements could be made so that we might fully understand the opportunity cost of doing it there versus with new land. Second one, this is a blank slate for us, and we should be looking at scenarios that are very dreamy. And at the very least, we should have a strict philosophy that we will not be crossing thresholds that will require widening highways. This should be a chance to reduce our car infrastructure. Third one is, as we go forward, I would suggest incorporating the following principles as soon as possible. One, we have 15-minute neighborhoods in the strategic plan. That should be there. Number 2, in our 2021 climate action plan, there's a focus on needing innovation in land use. So those are related. I'd like to see more of that. I would hope that we're looking at scenarios that consider an all-electric microgrid, semi-autonomous microgrid as we go forward. That probably is down the road, but I just have to say it now. And I also think about schools. So this is probably down the road, but BVSD and thinking about what that looks like. My fourth point, Deanna talked about climate scenarios, and this is not a nice to have. This is fundamental to our physical future, our basic needs in the economics of this future neighborhood. And I really look forward to more stress. It's much stress testing and real talk about what we're seeing with that in our math as possible. And my fifth laser point is probably for Natalie's team, in which is recognizing that transportation infrastructure service development can take time. I'd hope we look for no regrets things we can do, but as we do this in parallel in the north part of the city with respect to bikeways and transit connections, so that if and when this place is developed, that we've got things that are going to plug into it. Thank you.
All right, as there are no further hands up.
It's Taisha. I think the problem is the brown hand is over the black part of the
I see it now.
So
Okay, you're up.
but I will be brief, and I will echo all the comments that are being shared. And I just wanted to lift up, I wrote it down and and then I couldn't read my handwriting, but I think it says something like, I look forward to me, this is an opportunity to reimagine who gets to make decisions in our community. I would argue, you said something about 1977, and I just want to remind people that there has not been any Black people on council from 1977 until Junie got here. This feels like planning has been historically a very insular process. And so I'm hopeful that as we move forward for the next planning area, that for part 1, that we bust this little bubble of who gets to make this primary decision first. But since that's already sailed, I look forward to deeper relationship and participation by our local climate experts. We have so many at the federal, state, and local level who are in our community. And I'm eager for them to get involved and engaged in these analyses and scenarios and projections. The other is the business community, as we're thinking about retail and all these things, to not have the business community at the table when we are talking, the Latino chamber at the table when we're talking about this. It just seems like we are making decisions that are core to the foundation of this project without the perspectives and the feedback by those who have expertise that we don't have. And then lastly, of course, our NGO community, who have been serving and quite honestly holding the space of those of the governmental failures, because we don't have the funds to do what we need. And so again, I'm just excited for increased participation and to really push us towards that collaborate side of our engagement spectrum. So thank you so much.
All right, I will first turn to staff.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you all, council members, for the feedback on this. This is extremely valuable and exactly what we, hope to get through the study session. I do want to reflect on the fact that you expressed an interest in making sure that there is clarification and detail in the final report, detail about assumptions, and also maybe even challenging or questioning or providing a stress test, or that's not the right description, kind of a area of tolerance for those assumptions and thinking outside of the formula. One thing that I think we could get a little clear direction on is whether there is a majority that wants us to seek a fourth scenario regarding taking the parkland out. I indicate that saying that I don't quite know if that would be in the scope of the project. I'm sure we could expand the project with the consultants if needed. But it may also have implications on whether we would be able to get the final report to you in October as planned. If you needed that information before giving, say, a consensus or not a 5, we could get that to you in the next couple of weeks and resolve that through that mechanism.
Mayor?
Yeah, Brad, just to ask it to maybe sharpen that, is that maybe the request to look at incorporating a scenario where not all 190 acres are used for parks, where there's some flexibility in terms of using the park? Nobody wants to eliminate it, right?
Yeah, that's an important clarifier.
That would be fine. That would be fine. So let me ask my colleagues, is there a nod of 5 for doing so? All in favor? I see the hands. Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. And just to put a finer point on it, does that include with the qualifier that we'll get you the data on any implications on the timeline, or should we just plan on it regardless? Timeline for bringing the report forward.
Repeat that. I'm not sure I understand.
So I had mentioned that one option would be we could let you know within 2 weeks whether a fourth scenario pushes out the timeline for the report significantly or not. But if the consensus is to just move forward regardless of the implication on the timeline, we can do that and make that decision now.
If we're going to do the analysis, we should do the analysis, it seems to me.
Okay.
One thing we haven't talked about is just the intersection between this and the airport. So for example, if the airport passes, then what are the implications to that or to this project if that passes? So again, I'm just kind of thinking about that as well. So I guess, really some things are going to need to wait until November to see where we land on that. I'm just curious if if that passes in whatever iteration, would that have implications on our capacity to consider Area 3 or any of the other areas? So that's just something that's.
I would respond, these are both such long-term projects. Not one of us will be on council when they are completed at some point in the distant future. So I don't know that there's any immediate conflict.
Well, we're deciding though, Mark, whether or not we're making decisions right now though, on both of those. I mean, on this one potentially. So
Well,
that's where I'm saying, I think in the next 3 years and the update to the comp plan as well. So that's where I'm having this special wondering that I do think is relevant. So again, not necessarily for this conversation, but I do think there are implications. Either way, I guess where I'm going is if it's after, I would like to know how much longer um, it would take to add this component. If it's going to be 2 or 3 months versus a month, then I think that might be something. And
Brad,
we're
why don't
meeting.
you come back to us when you know that, and we can discuss it again.
We will do that. Yeah, thank you.
All right. And Brad, do you have enough from us in terms of the 75 suggestions and questions and comments that we have made to you this evening? Or
I
would you
think we
like
do, but
some-
I'll just check with the team for a thumbs up or a comment.
We can always give you more.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right. Well, we only dropped 11 minutes, and I think that's, we did pretty well at the end. I'm now going to turn to our city manager again, Nuria Rivera Vandermeid, to introduce our next topic.
Thank you, council member, and I appreciate the conversation. It was a technical discussion, and that really speaks to a lot of what will be coming in the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, and I know that's to come, and a lot more of these discussions in what really is a huge body of work. So just appreciate you all, because this is to me the tip of the iceberg on what we're really going to have long conversations about in the future. For now, another conversation that has also generated quite a lot of dialogue in community. And without more, I'll send it to our Director of Transportation and Mobility, Natalie Stifler.
Thanks, Nuria. Good evening, Council. We are very excited to be here tonight to share an update on the Iris Avenue Transportation Improvements Project, one of the priority corridors of the core arterial network that we call CAN. As you recall, the CAN is an initiative that you reaffirmed at your most recent retreat as a priority work program item for the city, and it's so great to be able to share the progress on this corridor with you this evening. I know you often hear me say this, but it's really incredible the progress the Transportation and Mobility Department has been making on improving our arterial streets as part of the CAN and the Vision Zero Action Plan. Following on the heels of successful implementation of the Baseline Road Phase 1 project, tonight you will learn about the work that the team has been diligently conducting for over a year now to get to this point. I want to lift up that traffic safety in our community's Vision Zero commitment is at the heart of this project. Specifically looking at how to redesign and transform Iris so that when mistakes do happen, they don't result in death or serious injury. It's also about our overall transportation network, ensuring there are intuitive, comfortable connections along and across our big arterial streets, and that these streets aren't the barrier to our community members getting to where they need to go safely and reliably. To meet our community's climate goals, we must offer robust, connected, and safe mobility choices, access, if you will, to the everyday destinations and opportunities that our wonderful city has to offer. And with that, I'll hand it over to Melanie Sloan, and she'll begin the presentation tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you. My name is Melanie Sloan, Principal Project Manager with Transportation and Mobility. I'm joined today by Lindsay Mers, Civil Engineering Manager. Tonight, we're pleased to bring you this update on the Iris Avenue Transportation Improvements Project. And we'll start with some background on the project and our ongoing design and community engagement process. Then we'll walk you through the 4 conceptual design alternatives that were presented to the community in late April. After that, we'll talk about some of the key differences between the conceptual alternatives and the next steps for the overall process. The focus of this study session is to dive into the wealth of initial analysis and design considerations that will form the basis of the full project evaluation that you all will consider later this fall. This will then lead to your decision as council on selecting one preferred conceptual alternative to move forward into final design and eventual implementation. No decision is being made this evening, and there is no recommended conceptual alternative at this stage of the process.
One good one. How's that?
Before we dive in, it's important to understand how we got here. The city's Vision Zero goal is at the center of it. We regularly collect and analyze crash data in our Safe Streets report, and then develop a multi-year Vision Zero action plan. One of our main Vision Zero actions is our work on the core arterial network, or CAN, and that's where 67% of traffic crashes resulting in death and serious injury occur. Using the safe systems approach to Vision Zero, we both look reactively at where crash patterns emerge over time, and also proactively at where common risk factors for future crashes exist. This is known as the city's high risk network, or HRN for short. The Vision Zero action plan prioritizes work on streets that are on the HRN and on the CAN, which includes IRIS. In addition to the city's Vision Zero action plan, Iris Avenue is identified in several key policy documents as a candidate for multimodal improvements. For example, Iris is designated in the low stress walk and bike network plan as a street that should receive vertically separated bike lane upgrades, as well as improvements to the pedestrian realm. This is important for not just for addressing safety and our community's Vision Zero goals, but also our policy goals around creating an interconnected, convenient, and intuitive multimodal network to offer people the mobility choices that will help achieve our community's climate commitment. And as a quick reminder, IRIS is on the CAN, and that's that set of core arterials prioritized by City Council in 2022 to advance our Vision Zero commitment and that interconnected network. The CAN is a multi-year work program that relies for the most part on external grant funding to achieve our community's vision for high-quality multimodal street transformations. You can see Iris Avenue shown as a priority corridor on the map, running east-west and north Boulder, where there is a need for enhanced network connectivity. Iris provides both local connections for the community to schools, shopping, and daily needs, as well as regional connections, such as from the diagonal into the heart of Boulder. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lindsay to talk about the project process, design considerations, and next steps.
Thanks, Molly. So good evening, Council. I'm Lindsay Mers, a Civil Engineering Project Manager with Transportation and Mobility. So to date, we've conducted extensive community engagement, both local to the corridor and citywide. So to inform our design process, we've grounded this project in an equitable, transformative community engagement approach that really has gathered a range of people's lived experience in traveling along IRIS. So we've also completed data collection and some technical analysis that, together with our professional best practices, really informed the development of the 4 conceptual design alternatives for the configuration of that street. So we shared those conceptual designs with the community for feedback at an open house at the end of April. And tonight we have the opportunity to also hear your feedback before we enter the next phase of the project, which is the formal conceptual alternatives evaluation, and then your selection of the preferred alternative this fall. Next. So the project team conducted extensive community engagement over the past year. So this included 34 engagement activities and resulted in more than 3,100 comments. So through a variety of engagement activities, we did open house meetings, walk-in talks, we met with community members where they are near the schools and the parks and even along the corridor. And the team really wanted to ensure that there were plenty of opportunities for the public to share their day-to-day experience and then voice their opinions and concerns. Next. So community feedback had several themes that emerged. So safety is the primary and most common concern. Participants, though, also reported high vehicle speeds. It causes excessive street noise and feelings of insecurity for people traveling in all modes.
There was concern about increased traffic congestion, as well as requests and support for making biking, walking, and crossing Iris safer and more comfortable. There was a desire for the city to consider the importance of Iris Avenue as a main east-west driving route, along with requests to remove the bike facility from Iris and place it on a parallel street instead. So these in-person and online conversations made it clear that for every person who opposed any change on Iris, there was also someone else who supported the changes to the street. And is often the case, most folks kind of fell towards the middle than those that were strongly for or against. Next. An in-person and online open house in April 24, followed by several pop-up community events. We hosted those to share the conceptual alternatives, and we wanted to gather feedback and priorities from community members. Over 500 people participated in conversations with staff and really among themselves, and 411 people completed the project questionnaire. When asked for their priorities for designing Iris, answers were grouped into 3 distinct tiers: highest, medium, and lowest priority. Vehicle travel time, reducing crashes on Iris, increasing walking and biking comfort and safety, and reducing speeds emerged as the top priorities. Next. As the project team was working on gathering this community input, we were also collecting existing conditions data to help the team understand how does Iris operate today, and then help determine the conceptual alternatives that would actually be the most feasible. So listed on this slide are the types of existing conditions data that was collected, which were gathered between September and October of 2023. So this data was collected, was all shared in your council member memo, and it's on those one-pager informational sheets as well. Next. So today, Iris generally has 2 vehicle travel lanes in each direction. They have standard bike lanes against the curb that are currently not separated from vehicles by any kind of buffer or even concrete protection. Sidewalks are in need of repair in many places, and bus stops don't have many amenities. The buses cross over the bike lane to pick up and drop off passengers. The speed limit is 35 miles an hour, but most people are driving 40 to 45 miles per hour or even more. So the corridor is located in the 100-year floodplain and conveyance zone, which creates limitations for some of the project design elements. And behind the curve, the right-of-way width and existing easements are not consistent. Next. So from 2016 to 23, there are a total of 345 vehicle crashes on Iris that averages to about 43 per year. And among these, 6 were severe crashes. The most common types of crashes included 143 rear end collisions, 58 crashes where the cars turned across oncoming traffic, and then 22 incidents involving pedestrians and cyclists. Now, the intersection of 26 and Folsom accounted for 45% of these crashes. And in all cases that involved the pedestrians and cyclists, the driver was at fault for not yielding at the intersections and driveways. I want to also note that the time period of 2016 to 23 was used for this data because that was the same data set that informed the Vision Zero action plan. Next. So earlier this year, the design team, we began the process of identifying potential conceptual designs for corridor improvements, and a long list of 13 possible designs was considered, each with a range of bike and ped facilities and vehicle lane configurations. This long list was narrowed down or screened, and this was based on the criteria shown on the slide and informed by existing conditions data and preliminary analysis. Now, 4 conceptual alternatives were considered feasible to move forward, and more detailed information can be found in the attachment to your memo. Next. As the 4 conceptual alternatives were advanced further, several elements emerged as fundamental to the overall design intent of the project. So to make Iris safer, more comfortable, and connected for people no matter how they want to get around, a number of design elements will be implemented regardless of which conceptual alternative is selected. And these improvements include end-to-end protected bike lanes, safer crossings, and optimized signals. Next. So the project limits are from Broadway to 28th Street. It's about 1.3 mile long stretch. And we're also looking at traffic calming on surrounding neighborhood streets as a secondary study area as a concurrent project. One important thing to note is that our initial or the preliminary traffic analysis tells us that the bookends of the corridor, so think 28th Street and then Broadway, support people that are walking, biking, rolling, and driving the most. And so changes to the bookends, which are shown in the light blue on the map, Will optimize existing crossing and connections to shops and businesses and frequent local and regional transit service. However, the number of vehicle travel lanes will not change at the bookends. This is in order to maintain the travel reliability along the corridor. Changes to the overall roadway width or the reorganization of space within the street would apply only to the area shown in black on the map, which is roughly 13th to Folsom. And that's the stretch where we've developed the 4 alternatives. Next. So what are the ideas on the table? So alternatives A and B would work within today's curb to curb width to accommodate upgrades to the existing bike lanes. A and B do this by reorganizing the street to introduce a 2-way center turn lane and then repurpose 1 travel lane in each direction to make the space needed for those upgraded protected bike lanes. Reorganizing the street is a proven safety countermeasure for moderating speeds and addressing many of the rear end crashes and right angle crashes between turning vehicles and oncoming traffic that we are seeing in our crash data. A and B would also have spot improvements to the existing sidewalks and the bus stops. Now, alternative C and D would expand the overall right-of-way width of the street and make space for the same walking, biking, and bus improvements, but preserve the existing number of vehicle lanes. Alternatives A and C have the 1-way protected bike lanes on each side of the street, and B and D have the 2-way or the bi-directional protected bike lane on the north side of the street. And so these alternatives represent different ways we can organize the street, and each one have their various trade-offs. Next. So let's take a closer look at the design elements that would be incorporated at the bookends of the corridor. So these would once again apply to the project no matter which alternative is selected. So as mentioned on the preceding slides, the vehicle lane configuration would not change at the intersection of Broadway. And that section is highlighted in yellow on the map. However, there will be improvements made to provide protection and safety for pedestrians and bicyclists. The slide shows a comparison of 1-way versus 2-way protected bike lanes extending all the way to the intersection to make a direct connection to the path that continues west to Foothill Elementary and the Newlands neighborhood. Other universal design elements of this bookend include we're going to optimize the signals and dedicated bike signals and pedestrian phases. So similar today when all vehicle movement is held while the pedestrians are crossing, and the transit stops are upgraded to a shared bus stop to provide larger boarding areas and accommodate the protected bike lanes. Next. So the other bookend, 28th Street, the vehicle lane configuration is also not proposed to change under any alternative. So east of Elmer's 2-mile underpass, the protected bike lanes become 2-way sidewalk level facilities on both sides of the street. That provides direct connections to those shopping centers, to the transit stops, to the path on 28th Street, to the routes east to the Wonderland Creek Greenway, and then the planned diagonal bikeway. Driveways will be constructed to meet current standards, and that westbound left into the Safeway parking lot will be prohibited due to recurring left turn crashes. Now, the project team will continue to coordinate with the stakeholders and the business owners at these shopping centers as the design moves forward. Next. So alongside speeding on Iris Avenue, there are some in the community who are concerned about speeding and cut through traffic on nearby side street, and that changes to Iris could make this increase. So this map shows that there are no neighborhood streets that provide a continuous east-west alternative for a diversion of traffic from Iris. However, there are several segments today that experience greater vehicle volumes and speed than others, and these are definitely worth a closer look as the design process for Iris moves forward. So these are segments like Linden and Kalmia and 26 north on the north side, and then Glenwood on the south side. And as a concurrent effort and to address these community concerns, the project team will identify specific locations along those segments that can receive some traffic calming measures like speed humps and speed tables and turn restrictions to manage traffic volumes and speeds. Next. So now that we've discussed the design elements that would be part of the project, no matter which design alternative is selected, let's switch gears and take a look at the components of the project that actually differ. So across all 4 conceptual design alternatives, the main differences come from whether we work within the existing curb-to-curb space or if we need to widen the curves out to accommodate features. So comparing these differences is at the heart of the formal project evaluation and your council decision this fall. Next. So two of the design alternatives, A and B, would make changes to how the road is laid out. So this is referred in your information packet as roadway reconfiguration, or essentially using the existing space on the street between the curbs in a new way. And according to the Federal Highway Administration, this approach isn't just about moving things around. It's really about safety. So by redesigning the road, rear end, left turn, and right angle crashes are reduced. Crossing safety for people walking and biking is improved because there are fewer lanes to cross. This additional space provides opportunities for other safety features like median refuge islands for crossings, similar to what you see at 15th and Iris, dedicated left turn lanes, or dedicated just turn lanes in general for vehicles, and then protected intersections. And the benefits of roadway reconfiguration would address common crash types on Iris and respond to community priorities for the street, including crash reduction, vehicle speeds, and biking and pedestrian safe and comfort. So the FHWA says roadway reconfigurations are a good fit for roads up to 25,000 vehicles a day. So even though Iris sees a lot of traffic, the numbers are generally steady. So from 13th Street to Folsom 26, it's about 20,040 cars per day, and it's been that way for about 20 years. And even with a 25% increase, Iris Avenue would still be within the FHWA's guidelines for roadway reconfiguration. Next. So again, roadway reconfiguration from 4 lanes to 3 on Iris is only being considered as part of alternatives A and B within the alternatives development area, which is highlighted in black on the map between 13th and Folsom. Alternatives C and D would keep things pretty much the same as they are today. The 2 travel lanes in each direction and no center turn lane. So this means C and D would not feature the safety improvements documented by the Federal Highway Administration, like the fewer crashes, speed moderation, and better crossings for pets. So traffic-wise, Iris Avenue west of 26 Folsom is similar to other roads around Boulder that have 1 lane in each direction. So think of places like Arapahoe Avenue west of Folsom, Valmont Road east of 47th, and 28th Street north of Palo Parkway. These roads carry similar levels of vehicle and manage traffic with 1 lane in each direction and dedicated turn lanes. The roadway reconfiguration under alternative A and B would operate similarly. It will be all about balancing how do we make Iris safer and easier to use while keeping things flowing smoothly for everyone who wants to travel. Next. So both A and B feature 2-way center turn lanes through a road reconfiguration. So center turn lanes have several safety benefits, such as they decrease the total number of crashes because it's providing a dedicated space for vehicles to turn. It lowers the risk of right angle crashes by reducing the number of lanes that side street drivers have to cross. It enhances traffic flow because we remove turning vehicles from through traffic, and it enhances safety for pedestrians and cyclists because we reduce the number of lanes they have to cross, which shortens their crossing distance. Next. Now, protected intersections are designed to encourage people driving to make slower, more careful turns. They physically separate people walking or biking from vehicles, and they make it easier for everyone to see each other. In alternatives A and B, repurposing the lanes from 4 to 3 creates the space at the intersections for these protected elements. This means it'll be safer to cross the street and lower the chances of crashes. The best part is this can be done without needing to secure easements from nearby property owners. But in alternative C and D, it's a bit trickier. We wouldn't be able to add these protected intersection elements unless the public right-of-way is expanded through additional easements or property acquisition. And that means we might not be able to make things as safe at the intersection. Next. So responding quickly to everyday emergencies and natural disasters is an important consideration. And when evaluating each alternative, it was ensured that the current eastbound lane setup from Broadway to 16th and then from 25th to 28th remains unchanged. This maintains the city's ability to respond to both everyday emergencies and major disasters unchanged from how they operate today. So discussions on the roadway design features that we'll need to use for the center turn lane to use that as a second eastbound evacuation lane east of 16th are being continued with Boulder Fire Rescue, Boulder Police Department, and the Office of Disaster Management. So as depicted on the slides, the center turn lane of A and B would enhance day-to-day emergency operations because this center lane provides a dedicated lane for emergency vehicles. And alternative B and D's, the 2-way protected bike lanes, they are wide enough to accommodate emergency vehicles and would serve as an emergency priority lane during a disaster. Next. So the conceptual designs propose two options for protected bike lanes that would provide a direct, low-stress route between Broadway and 28th. These example photos show baseline roads, one-way tall curb protected bike lanes, and a 6-inch curb protected two-way bike lane in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For Iris, the vertical element will be determined in a future design phase. So one-way lanes running on both sides of the street follow the direction of vehicle traffic, and they provide reduced conflicts with turning vehicles. However, there's generally less space efficient than the two-way lanes, which is particularly important on a constrained corridor like Iris. Now, two-way lanes allow people biking to move in both directions and are aligned on one side of the street. The additional width can allow for passing and side-by-side riding. However, there is increased potential for conflicts with turning vehicles as drivers have to look for cyclists traveling in both directions. These conflicts can be minimized by locating that two-way protected bike lane on the side of the street with the least side streets and driveways and through other mitigations like the signage and pavement markings you see in the photo. The Vision Zero action plan identified signalized and unsignalized intersections as two of the top 6 risk factors that account for the most frequent and severe crashes citywide. With both of these factors present on Iris and a history of pedestrian and bicycle crashes at intersections along Iris, all of the alternatives assume signal changes to separate vehicle and bike movements in accordance with industry best practices for protected bike lanes. So as a result, end-to-end vehicle travel time does increase for all alternatives to ensure that intersections are safer for everyone who uses them. And so as we laid out both types of bike lanes on Iris, we found that the one-way bike lanes in alternatives A and C would have more conflict points overall because there's a higher concentration of driveways and intersections on the south side. The north side two-way lanes proposed by alternatives B and D would have more sun exposure in the winter and have a wider effective width, which would make them easier to maintain and then allow for the side-by-side riding. And with major destinations along Iris concentrated in the bookend areas and the north-south bike routes utilizing signalized intersections to cross Iris, we believe the two-lane lanes will be safe, comfortable, and intuitive for people biking. Next. So Iris Avenue is currently 50 feet wide, and changes to the corridor can be achieved in 2 ways. We can use the existing curb width, or we can widen the roadway. Expanding the roadway width involves impacts behind the curb, such as acquiring easements, relocating stormwater systems, and removing street trees. Alternative C and D necessitate roadway widening. Alternative C expands equally to the north and the south, while D widens only to the north. But both alternatives require more private property easements, utility adjustments, and tree removals. Consequently, alternative C and D would be more expensive and take longer to implement than A and B. Now, A and B fit within the existing 50-foot right-of-way. They result in fewer impacts behind the curb, so therefore fewer private property easements or affected utilities, and that remove significantly fewer trees, and therefore would be less costly and can be implemented more swiftly. Next. As we are still in the earliest stage of design for this project, we don't have enough detail to generate full cost estimates to compare alternatives. However, these high-level order of magnitude estimates are based on what we know from recent projects like the CAN Baseline Phase 1 and 2 effort and the 30th Street Corridor. And so from these, we estimate that alternatives A and B would cost around $5 million. Alternative C and D would be approximately 3 to 4 times more costly than alternatives in A and B. And this is really due to the fact that reconstruction of the curbs and the utility relocations and the tree removals and the easement acquisitions really require additional time to design and construct. And C and D would take about 3 to 4 times longer to construct than A and B, and this longer duration leads to greater impacts to adjacent property owners and the community as construction detours and noise is part of their daily life for longer. Next. So the project team understands there will be concerns about increased travel times. Our preliminary traffic analysis for all 4 alternatives was conducted in such a way to inform you all as our decision makers in the community of what everyday trips might be like, as well as the occasional peaks or the worst of the worst. And so in our profession, we know that people driving tend to remember those outlier moments, even if they happen less than 5% of the time and only during certain days of the week or times of the year. So for this study session, we want to lay out the full potential range for you. What are most people driving experiences, as well as those off chance peaks that they'll remember. Next. So what most people driving will experience falls into the average and the 95th percentile or the most trips categories. And the peaks that people remember represent the maximum category. And these are shown along the top of this graphic. Currently, it takes about 3 to 4 minutes to travel from the intersection of 28th Street through the intersection of Broadway. And there are rare instances that could reach up to 4 to 5 minutes. So based on the modeling for all alternatives, the end-to-end average travel time could increase by up to 1 minute and 3 seconds. Most trips might see an increase of up to 1 minute and 4 seconds, and the very slowest trips could add 2 minutes and 9 seconds. As mentioned a few slides ago, all alternatives assume signal changes to separate the vehicle and bike movements. And so this results in end-to-end vehicle travel time increases under all alternatives to ensure that intersections are safer. Alternatives A and B do experience slightly higher travel times in C and D due to that road reconfiguration between the bookends. And so what do these numbers mean for someone's actual driving experience? So in general, a travel time increase of about 40 to 60 seconds or less are mostly imperceptible changes that you really wouldn't feel over time. From 1 to 2 minutes, people driving might occasionally feel that delay. Drivers may experience an extra stop at a signalized intersection, the red light, or spend more time in acute traffic. Now, around 2 minutes or more, people driving may feel the delay more frequently. Every now and then, you may have to wait at an extra signal cycle if you're at the back of the queue, at some point in your journey. So these are professional rules of thumb, but I think they're helpful for your consideration of a topic that can be very subjective. So travel times vary by time of day of the week, season of the year, and many more variables. And so the numbers in the table on the slide are a tool to help estimate how the operations of the street might change as a result of this project. Next. So to effectively compare and evaluate the 4 design alternatives, staff applied 17 specific considerations categorized into 5 groups shown on this slide. So for each alternative, staff conducted a preliminary analysis to determine whether its proposed features would result in improvements, worsen existing conditions, or lead to no change. And these were shared at the open house and on the project website, and they're found in your packets. Next. And so the next phase of the project process involves a formal evaluation of the 4 conceptual alternatives. The Community and Environmental Assessment process, or the CEAP, is Boulder's formal review process that assesses the potential impacts of capital improvement projects to help select the best alternative. So the CEAP uses the established CEAP checklist. It uses some project-specific evaluation criteria and also that community input to identify a recommended alternative. Next. So for next steps, staff will complete the formal CEAP evaluation of the 4 alternatives and identify a recommended alternative. In late July, we're going to host a 3rd open house, and we're going to share the recommended alternative with the community. And just a quick side note, we'd really love to invite council to assist in getting the word out about this upcoming community engagement, as well as participate, because we did really appreciate seeing those of you that came out to the first 2. So in August, we're going to incorporate feedback from the community that we gathered at the open house and the submitted comments, and we're going to finalize the CEAP. And in early September, we're going to bring that CEAP and recommended alternative to TAB, and they will make their recommendation to council for the CEAP approval. In late September, this item will appear on council's call-up check-in agenda. And if it's called up by council, the item would then appear on the October 10th council meeting for a public hearing, and then the approval decision on the CEAP and the recommended alternative. And after that, if approved by council, the project would enter final design over 2025. And so with that, we invite council to consider the following questions as you begin your discussion. And we really do appreciate the opportunity to bring this body of work to you this evening. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that presentation. And are you going to leave that slide up for us, or are we going to return to
We put those questions in chat, council member, so we can take them down. Thank you.
Okay, that's great.
Team's always ahead of me.
So we're going to start with questions and move on from there. First questioner will be Council Member Marquis.
Hi, thank you for the presentation and for being clear about what our goals are and that there's still time for community engagement. The first question I have is, given the level of collisions we've seen, what are some of the short-term gaps that we're implementing right now to address the quick? Are there any quick hits? And I noticed a couple things on the chart that you were evaluating some areas around Elmer's 2 Mile and Folsom. But is there anything we can do right now, since there seems to be a long timeline regardless of which direction we go?
Thank you for that question, Tina. I'm going to kind of act as the traffic controller because I imagine there's going to be a lot of questions. We have a big team of folks here this evening with us, both staff from the department and also our consultant. So I'm going to act as kind of divvying out questions. And I think for that one, I will ask Devin Joslin, our principal traffic engineer, to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, Council. My name is Devin Joslin. I'm the city's principal traffic engineer. Thank you for that question. With respect to some of the quicker implementation items that we're looking at for Iris Avenue, one is, you might recall, in December, Council passed a resolution to allow for the use of expanded photo enforcement on arterial streets. And Iris was one of those streets that was designated in that resolution. So that is now an option for us to get some speed enforcement out on Iris. A second thing that we could look at as an interim solution would be kind of a quicker build access control at that Safeway access on the 28th Street bookend side of the corridor. That is a location that we know has a pattern of crashes that is correctable by removing that westbound left turn movement. And that could be done through kind of a quicker build process if that was something we decided to move forward with at that location. The other thing that is on the agenda to be reviewed more thoroughly is our left turn and signal timing practices. And there could be some options for alternate phasing at intersections to reduce the potential for left turn crashes.
And just to follow up, for something like the, since we already passed a resolution around photo radar, and also with respect to the ending the left-hand turn at a Safeway, is that something that the traffic group can do without council direction? You don't need to come to us for that.
That is correct.
Okay. So then I just wanted to clarify that just because some of the crash data in that area is, it seems like we should try to do whatever we can, since most of these options are going to take a little bit of time. The other question I was curious about with engagement is how we're interacting with the people that are commuting in and how it affects their ability to access employment in Boulder.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll let Valerie Watson speak to that one in more detail. I'll say that we did get the word out along the way to our regional partners and to basically engage with folks that are coming in from other cities to access their jobs and services within the city. But Valerie, do you want to add more detail around that?
Yeah, sure. I think Natalie covered some of the coordination that we've been doing with our regional partners. I'll also highlight some of the business engagement that we've done in partnership with Boulder Chamber. There are a lot of employers that actually are located along this corridor, and we've held a series of engagement activities where we've been able to speak with business owners, business operators, and talk about the needs of their employees who very often are coming from outside of our community to work. So that's been another arena in which we've been able to get a lot of feedback that helps us understand, what is their experience when they're traveling to work. I think we did hear a lot about that end of the corridor at 28th, because that's just where a concentration of businesses are.
And sorry, for the record, Valerie Watson is Deputy Director of Transportation.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then another question I had was around just maintenance in general. So Iris right now has a lot of maintenance issues that are unrelated to the crashes, and how, and I know Nuria has talked a lot about deferred maintenance or a need to increase our maintenance budget. Do we feel like we're we have enough money that we're putting in funding to maintain whatever it is that we do, not just on Iris, but in general.
Yep. So I'll start with the high level response, and then Garrett Slater, our capital projects manager, can speak in more detail. So at a high level, certainly as we approach each of these corridors, we're thinking about maintenance. Scott Schlecht, our maintenance manager, is involved in these projects and in these project conversations, and just what we need from a resources standpoint, not only from like pavement condition, but also to do snow and ice removal once we build facilities like we're talking about this evening. So that's an integral part of it. And we think about what is the kind of life cycle cost related to those maintenance needs. And that's certainly like an improvement we've made over time, I think, as an organization, to be thinking about those future needs. But Garrett, do you want to speak to pavement and how we try to kind of time these projects with our pavement management program?
Yes, I think we can turn to Baseline Road as a great and recent example of how we have phased work with our capital maintenance programs prior to delivering capital enhancements projects and in conjunction with those capital maintenance delivering enhancements. So phase one of Baseline Road introduced the tall curb treatment to provide greater protection for cyclists on the bicycle lanes. And that was done in conjunction with the repaving efforts. We have other recent examples. For example, we just finished Moorhead just this past week on paving and providing some mobility enhancements there. And while it's still premature, I suspect that Iris would be very similar to these recent efforts, and that we would look to integrate some early action improvements to the corridor as part of the paving efforts, because Iris is identified as a corridor that we're looking to provide some preventative pavement maintenance for here in the coming years.
Okay, and then I just had two quick other questions. One is we're looking at a two-way bike track, but I haven't seen that on other roads in Boulder. Is that just being proposed because of the unique character of Iris, or is that something we would look at other roads, or would this be an anomaly?
I am going to give, like so many people from the team could take this one, but I'm going to actually have Daniel Sheeter speak to the two-way design of the bicycle lane related to B&D.
Good evening, Daniel Sheeter, Principal Transportation Planner in the Transportation Mobility Department. Thank you for the question. Yeah, we kind of spoke to it a little bit in the presentation, but just to kind of reiterate, we do think that the character of Iris, with many of the destinations being at the bookends and not a lot of intermediate major destinations along the corridor, that it can be suitable to a two-way facility. So it kind of fits that character of the street. Anomaly, I'm not sure. We have more corridor projects to consider bike facility designs on, but we do think it's a good could be a good fit for Iris. I would add the Moorhead project Garrett mentioned. We did implement a very short segment of two-way on-street protected bike lane there to make a path connection, to improve a path connection. So you can experience a short segment of one now that was just completed this week. So.
Okay, and then my last question doesn't really need to be answered, but I understand you can't give us proposed budgets right now or timelines, and I understand that these options are magnitudes more expensive than other ones, but it would be helpful to understand just ballpark what we're talking about in terms of, is it 1 year versus 3 years, or $10 million versus 50? It's because we know we have a lot of different priorities, so it becomes relevant.
Right. Yeah, and I think we can speak to that tonight at a high level. We mentioned in the presentation learning from Baseline Phase 1 and Phase 2, and also 30th Street. Those projects that are similar in ways are about 5 million. You could say about $5 million. And so we expect that A and B would fall somewhere in that realm, where C and D would cost 3 to 4 times that, just from the sheer need to take right away to be able to expand the footprint of the road. As far as timelines go, we have budget, and we expect from a work plan standpoint to be able to move forward with design and final engineering design to lead to construction in 2025. The funding to actually implement any of these options, we would need to continue to identify through the coming year to be able to be ready to implement it in 2026 or beyond. Like baseline, we broke that up into phase 1 and phase 2. So with phase 1, we were able to identify local funding to be able to identify phase 1, recognizing that to be able to implement the entire project, we needed to look for grant funding. And that's the way that we often implement transportation projects, because they are just expensive projects to build. Transportation is expensive. And so we would be looking at certainly external funding to be able to implement the full scale of the project, whether it's A through D. But the likelihood to be able to do one quicker than the other is, as we've identified, A and D would certainly be on a quicker timeline than C and D.
Okay, that's extremely helpful. Thanks so much. I'm done.
All right, next up is Mayor Pro Tem Spear.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the presentation. And a couple of questions related to your second question. One is just around thinking about the differences in the designs. Is the use of the bikeways and walkways impacted at all by whether they are two-way on one side or one-way on each side of the road? Like, is there any data from other cities or anything about that?
Valerie, Daniel, either one of you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think I can start to answer and then turn it over to Daniel, and I'll properly introduce myself this time. Valerie Watson, Deputy Director. I think your question is, does just to restate, does a two-way protected bike lane impact its usability being on just one side of the street? I think in general, when folks are making connections, they may not always be traveling from one end of the corridor to the other, right? So they may be crossing to get to, a route that they're going either north, south, or east, west. So, you can kind of think of a two-way protected bike lane as that little connective tissue along a corridor like this. And I'll hand it over to Daniel because you may have some other points you'd like to add.
Yeah, just I think, with the crossing points along Iris at the signalized intersections and the enhanced crossing we have at 15th Street to kind of travel north-south, just to kind of expand on what Valerie said, that two-way facility can provide that connection between those crossing points, and because they're controlled, right? They're either enhanced or controlled with signals, and still be a kind of intuitive way to travel across the corridor as well as along the corridor for trips that might go end to end or north and south. So.
Okay, thank you. And there's no, are there studies or anything that look at the differences or anything like that?
I'm not aware of, I think there are fewer conflict points, fewer access points or intersections, and there is a 3-to-1, I think, or 3 times as many conflict points on the south side versus the north side. So that was informative there. And then we have two-way facilities, kind of like I mentioned in the last response. There's a path connection at the west end, which is a two-way facility to Foothill Elementary and into the Newlands neighborhood. And then paths along 28th Street and points east along the diagonal and the future planned diagonal bikeway that there's some symmetry with there. So.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question is sort of a data one as well. Does the usage of side streets by cars increase, or does vehicle speed change or anything like that following 4 to 3 lane conversion?
Valerie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So if I heard that right, do speeds along the corridor change? And Councilmember Spear, what was the second part?
On that, so I'm thinking about side streets, right? So some of the emails that we've been getting have been people concerned, like if you reduce the number of lanes here, people are just going to move to side streets and they're going to speed through them and they're going to, use them as the new Iris. I personally, since it's been probably 16 years since I lived in North Boulder, I would get completely lost if I deviated from Iris. And so I'm curious if there's data on when others have done conversions of, say, 4 lanes to 3 lanes, do side streets see more traffic as people try to, wind their way through?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. So, I think we know that anytime we make changes to roadways, especially for long stretches, you can see traffic patterns evolve and adjust. And with this project, it's something we've really been thinking about from the beginning. We did a lot of engagement with the community last year before we ever, really put pen to paper in the conceptual design process. And it was a very strong sentiment from the community that they were experiencing, higher speeds or volumes of traffic on the neighborhood streets than they would like. And you can kind of see evidence of previous investment by the city in traffic calming devices on many of the streets in the area in North Boulder around this corridor. You'll see things like speed humps, turn restrictions, things like that have already been installed in certain places. And so, one of the things we really made sure to do in our initial data collection is just get a good baseline of volumes and speeds along our neighborhood streets so that we could understand the impact of changes if they were to be made in the future. And what that tells us is that some neighborhood streets experience a little bit higher speeds and volumes than others today. And so because that was really something we heard as a strong request from the community throughout our engagement over the past year and a half, and I think we said tonight in our presentation, we are looking at neighborhood traffic calming as a concurrent effort to this project. And we'll be able to, through the final design process, really advance some ideas of where we could install those types of traffic calming measures that could look like speed humps or turn restrictions, things like that, speed feedback signs that really help address the issues where they're present. So, I hope that that's something that's very clear, is that we have been thinking about that since the beginning of the project, and it will be addressed if any changes are made to the corridor.
Thank you. That kind of leads into my last question, which is on the engagement end, sort of ties into number 1 and 2 of your questions. What plans do we have for communicating back out impacts? So say one of these moves forward, what is the plan for, coming back to this in a few years after the changes would happen, to report back to folks, to listen in, hear about anything that they're noticing, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I kind of alluded to a little bit of the timeline. So once council gives us direction this fall on how we move forward, we'll move forward with design in 2025, and then we would look to begin implementation dependent on funding in 2026 and the coming years. As we often do once we implement projects, and we look at just speed data and how our corridors are essentially operating over the years. And so it would just become a part of our kind of normal evaluation and monitoring, like we do with all the other corridors across the network. That's largely what drives our Safe Streets report that we update every few years. And so this would be a part of that data set, and we will be able to learn, essentially how it's being activated with folks using the new facilities.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the presentation and all this information.
All right, next up is Council Member Shuhard, followed by Council Member Folkerts.
Thank you, Lindsay, Melanie, Daniel, Valerie, Garrett, Natalie, and team. I am incredibly excited about this for its the role of rebalancing the way arterials work citywide that Iris will play, but also as a neighbor who lives near Iris, block or 2 away, and I'm a driver, cyclist with 2 small kids, pedestrian, a runner, and there's so many parts of this that you're going to improve. And like my last run on Iris, I had to jump into the street and make traffic stop because there were tweens like 10-year-olds trying to get across, and that's just, you know, to the ball fields, and nobody would stop for them. And that's just one of the many users that I know you're gonna benefit here. So appreciate staff's intense and comprehensive work to do this. And I also appreciate our previous councils recognizing this is a values-based decision about what kind of transportation we want to have citywide. So I'll go to the questions now. The first question, I don't have questions about the process really at this point. I think it's clear that council asked you to do this in 2022 at the retreat with CAN. The direction to make protected bikeways on Iris was explicit. You've given us a framework that has everything we've asked for and more. And I think this has been a show and tell, not only of the design options, but of your capable staff that has anticipated pretty much every question that I've heard from anybody. So I have no big picture questions. I do, though, maybe just going to question number 2 on design options. I've talked to a lot of folks about A versus B, or I guess more generally the idea of the bikeways on both sides of the road versus on the other side. And I often, you know, just as thinking about it as a user, sometimes think about the difference between maybe going down Folsom, where they're on both sides, or South Broadway. It's not maybe the best analog, but they're on the other side. But then I find myself comparing subjective experiences of others and thinking that's, you know, I'm a little anxious then suddenly that we have council members who might be, I suppose, projecting their own kind of experiences on this too much. So I guess my question, and I prepared this looking at the list of questions in the memo that was phrased a little differently, but it would just be that as you go to making recommendations, that I guess there's a comment, because this is what I prepared for, but that if there's ways to think about further fleshing out some objective criteria to evaluate the merits of A versus B. For example, I'll give you a few that are in addition to what you have in table 4, which I think is a great core of it. But one would be legibility. So what design options are most understandable and comprehensible to users, particularly cyclists and pedestrians? Number 2, are there any key time differences between both bicyclists and pedestrians? If there's any way, I don't know if there's time to do modeling, but I'm just thinking, like, this is a utilitarian question, really. Like, where are the socks and flows of cyclists going from where to where? If there's any way to kind of get at that, I think that really does underpin the question of like which of those is more efficient for users. Another one, if there's a way to address it, would be you got at this a little bit, but like really, what are some of the additional risk factors that are introduced with either the bikeways on both sides versus the other? I think each of them have some pros and cons, and maybe to see those side by side might help. And then finally, just thinking again between A and B, or the 2 sides versus one, just a little more on like the experiences of specifically pedestrians, specifically corridor users, and then kids, seniors, and people with disabilities. So I'm just thinking, like, I personally, I can't evaluate on my own what I like better versus those two. So to the extent that there's data to support any of those, or any other ways to add like some additional objective criteria, I think that will help council as we consider the recommendation to really evaluate in an objective way the difference. That's mostly what I had. Although I guess I did have one question, Natalie. This was kind of in the other category, which was a question in the packet. And I didn't see this. Forgive me if I missed it, but I'm wondering about the engagement process overall, the engagement approach. And I wasn't sure if this had what from our community engagement approach framework our approach has stemmed from. Like, did it come from, you know, the Inform and so on spectrum? And can you just talk about the decision for like what's the template for this engagement approach?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And Erica, feel free to jump in if I get anything wrong. So we tend to, with projects that especially that fall into the category of a SEEP, that's more on the involve and collaborate end of the spectrum. And so that's certainly where we've been. We have for the last year, been engaging heavily with the community. I think we kind of summarized that in, it was like 34 touch points or something where we've been engaging with community. And many of those is what shaped the alternatives that have come forward this evening. And that, as we mentioned, there will be another touch point as we share the staff recommendation here in a few weeks with community, and then we'll include their input as we finalize the SEEP and bring that recommendation to CAB and City Council in the fall. So, and with our SEEPs, that is typically where we fall. We fall in that more involved, collaborate with the spectrum, because that's kind of what's been expected in the community over the years. Erica, did I misspeak or miss anything? Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. And can you just clarify what gets this tagged as a SEEP? Like, what's a SEEP project?
It's essentially just an alternatives analysis process that is unique to the city of Boulder that we've developed.
But like what I'm saying, when do you use SEEP, and which leads us to the involve and collaborate versus not?
When there will be essentially significant impact to the community, and that there's policy trade-offs associated with the project.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then my final question, this might be rhetorical, but if you can answer now, please do. I'm just wondering, as we go forward with CAN in other corridors beyond Iris, if there might theoretically be options for public engagement that are more centered in the citywide CAN system as a whole, and what it will take to make all of the pieces of it be successful, and engaging at that kind of whole city system level, and be more consolidated at the street by street level. Like, does that, I guess, theoretically seem like an opportunity?
Theoretically, anything is possible. So I think it really is a matter of council's direction. The CAN obviously stemmed from a council priority, and we took that as each corridor we would conduct it kind of a unique alternative analysis process as we approached each corridor, and that involved a heavy community engagement process to get us to where we are today and in the coming months. And so our expectation, I think from my perspective and from staff's perspective, is that we would continue that approach unless there's different direction from council to consider a different community engagement approach as we move forward with other priority corridors.
Thank you. And thank you again to you and the whole team for this great work.
Okay, next up is Councilmember Folkerts, followed by Councilmember Weiner and Mayor Brockett.
Yeah, so my question is going to be a little similar to Ryan's. I was wondering about, potentially looking at like street typologies or if there are ways that we could potentially streamline this. And maybe I'm the only council member who feels this way, but it feels like we took a really deep dive into fleshing out sort of a pretty full design for each one of these 4 scenarios. And in my opinion, 2 of the scenarios don't really provide the safety and sort of crash reduction that to me seems like one of the core goals of this project, and have a cost and timeline that make them not infeasible, but not nearly the same kind of strong contenders as the other 2 options. So I guess I'm just wondering, could you see a way of restructuring for future corridors that might streamline a little bit more than what this process was? I suppose you might want to wait until we see how smoothly this goes.
Yeah, so I think, similar to the response to Ryan, I think that our perspective is that each corridor, it presents its own constraints and context that requires different policy trade-offs as you move, from corridor to corridor. So, baseline was different from Iris, and Iris will be different from Folsom, and then the next street after that, right? And so I think that's where it's really up to council. Like, we would look for policy direction on how we want to approach the work. And so there's always that opportunity when we come forward and, we provide regular updates around kind of what the scope is going to look like for an upcoming project. And so if there's input on what that kind of engagement process looks like, we're definitely open to that. But typically, because of just the nature of each corridor being so different, it's important for everybody to really understand and go into it kind of eyes wide open of what those trade-offs are as you approach each corridor.
Lauren, you're on mute.
I appreciate that it's a public street and like an engaged level of community outreach, I think is important at the least. So thank you for your work on this. And that was my only question.
Okay. All right. Councilmember Weiner, you are on stage.
Can you hear me with my microphone?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
My question mark is, am I going to have time to give comments later, or is this like a question comment combo situation?
I would do questions, but we will have a fairly truncated comment section as we're not making any final decisions tonight.
Okay, so when do you all want to hear my perspective, since I have driven on two-way bike lanes? You want to hear that later, or you want to hear it now?
Later.
Okay, then we can go to the next person.
Okay, Mayor? Your hand was up, your hand is down?
It's a comment.
Okay. I will ask a couple of quick questions myself then. One of the questions I raised in my hotline, are we getting the most impact out of the investment on Iris as opposed to other arterial roadways in Boulder? I mean, I note that Iris serves about 130 bikers per day, which is not that robust. Would we have been better off looking at someplace else first?
Valerie, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Councilmember Wallach. We really take a systemic and safe systems approach to traffic safety with our Vision Zero approach here in Boulder. And that means that we look both, at where crashes have occurred, reactively. And we also look proactively at where there is risk for future crashes to occur. And so I think if I understand your question, you're wondering if there's like a cost benefit ratio to speak to. And that's something common in the engineering profession. Certain grant programs are even based around that. What's the likelihood that the intervention is going to have a crash reduction factor, so a cost benefit ratio. I think our Vision Zero approach and the profession in general through work at the FHWA is really shifting to looking at both proactive and reactive approaches to traffic safety. And so with Iris, it's really been elevated as a corridor that we're working on because it was found to be on the high risk network. That's part of our Vision Zero action plan. And it was identified along with 3 other corridors for quick action by 2027 because it not only has a higher rate of serious and fatal crashes, but it has 5 of the 6 most common risk factors in Boulder for future crashes to occur. And so, when we are looking at implementing safety improvements across the city, we really look to policy documents like our Vision Zero action plan, our low stress walk and bike network plan, which is part of our transportation master plan. And we look to those to help us, develop our work plans as a city. And so when the CAN, was really created as a work program for us to pursue, it was predicated on the fact that our arterials in the city are really where we have that higher incidence of crashes, but also that higher risk. So that would be, I think, a way to frame why we're working on this corridor now. And I think that would be the best that we can kind of offer as a cost benefit. We are trying to, make sure that when crashes do occur across our system where we know they're more likely to occur, that they don't result in death and serious injury.
You've convinced me, but my next question is, $5 million is a nice piece of change. Have you sourced the money? Where is it coming from?
We haven't identified implementation dollars.
Okay, and my last question is, in light of the financially constrained circumstances in which we find ourselves, does it make any sense to immediately implement sort of the interim steps that you've described tonight, and see if that actually has an impact on the Iris corridor, before going full bore with a $5 million capital investment? And some
So
of those,
that was yeah, that's a great question. And I think that was what I was trying to allude to, is that once we kind of have direction of where we're headed, we would move forward with design. And then at that point, we would be able to kind of break it into phases, either phase 1 and phase 2, or whatever it means from kind of a funding standpoint. And we would get to those kind of lower cost, lower hanging fruit, but certainly effective in solving some of the bigger safety concerns that we have in the near term, and then continue to seek funding for full implementation.
okay, that finishes my questions. We're gonna go into the comment period, which I know everyone will be extremely brief. Just to point out that the only thing that stands between us and our summer recess is us. So keep that in mind as you make those comments. And would anybody like to kick it off? Mayor Brock, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. I have a 72-point set of comments. If you can just budget 45 minutes to an hour and a half, I think we'll get out of here pretty quick.
It's done.
No, I just, my comment is just a huge thank you to the whole team. You all have done really remarkable work. The analysis level is extraordinary, and I know we're not finalized yet, but I look forward to the finalization of the criteria and the analysis, because I think we are elected officials. We are not traffic engineers, and so we rely on you all to do the research and the analysis, and you've done a phenomenal job so far. And I look forward to the next steps. And yeah, I've some directions I'm kind of pointed in, but I do want to hear the final analysis before I'm making any decisions. So look forward to hearing more. The one very anecdotal thing I'll just say, I was just traveling out of the country and rode on some really lovely cycle tracks. So I'm more used to one-way bike lanes around here, but looks like we have some good alternatives out there. So thanks for what you've done, and looking forward to the next steps. And also just the last thing of how it was the retreat 2.5 years ago where we kicked off the can. We didn't kick the can down the road, but here it is developing in a very physical way. So really great to see the work come to fruition. Thanks again.
Okay, Councilmember Weiner, you've waited patiently for your comments.
Well, first of all, I want to talk about my two-way bike lane experience, which just happened conveniently this past May when I was in California, in Encinitas. And I was a little worried because, I don't like new things, but I will say that it was a great experience, and it was super fun. And it also felt safe, really safe. And the other thing that was great was I had an ocean view. Now, I know we won't be getting that here, but that was also great. So any questions, you can call me and I'll give you my full experience, not under time constraint. But I give the two-way bike lane a big thumbs up. I really loved being able to also have a section where people could ride side by side for a short time, depending on who's coming the other way, of course. So now I want to go on to my feelings about Iris, which is I would not even go on Iris. I'm so petrified, taking my life into my hands. So actually, when I'm even trying to cross Iris, I decide to just turn around and go back the other way. That's how I feel about Iris. So I'm pretty excited about this. And I hope the community does understand that it's really about safety. And it's just so incredibly unsafe. It feels unsafe, and it is unsafe. It's a combination of actual facts and feelings. But I do really like B for the reason that besides it being a unique, fun experience, it's also less expensive and easier. And I will end with saying thank you to, first of all, Lindsay, That was an incredible presentation. You hit all my, you know how I like pros and cons I mentioned at the retreat, pros and cons? You gave me all my pros and cons. Natalie, you gave me all my, it was like pros and cons fest today. That's all I can say. And you had so much expression, Lindsay. So I do want to thank you for a riveting presentation. And thanks to the entire department and everybody who spoke for really giving us a great information. I enjoyed this presentation very much.
Okay. With that, we turn to Councilmember Shuhard.
Okay, I squeezed off most of my comments earlier because I didn't know we were going to have this period. So just two things. I think maybe staff is too polite to share this expression, but there's a phrase that is we don't know if we need a bridge by looking at who's swimming across the river. And the idea is places that are so hostile and dangerous don't attract people to use them to begin with. So we don't have a lot of fatalities with people on bikes on Foothill Parkway because that's not a place that anybody would go near. And so I think what's exciting about this project is we see the opportunity to create a more humane existence along Iris that will draw people to want to go there and create a better balance for everybody. So my only final thing to say is I've already gushed at how happy I am with what staff has done on this, but I just would ask us all to reflect on the exhaustive work that has gone into answering and answering questions and being extremely patient in maybe a first time through doing a process of this magnitude. And with that, will we have a chance after we make decisions on Iris to think about how to accelerate the process of implementing safe streets, which will probabilistically save lives and save life-changing injuries. Every month we can deploy things faster, the more we're going to save. So I just ask us to leave thinking about that. Thanks, everybody.
All right. I have finally recognized Taisha's hand up signal, and you're up, followed by Mayor Pro Tem.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I have to echo the awesomeness of the presentation, the materials. I feel like I can see the whole picture, but then I can also get into the really minute details. And so again, I too want to thank you for that. I also want to thank all those who have written in and expressed their concerns. And I too had concerns about the evacuation routes. But I talked to the emergency response team or whatever that word is. And I felt good after talking to Mike. And Mike, he's got a high threshold. He's really thinking about all the things. And I walked away from that conversation feeling confident that these changes A, B, C, or D would not would not have the negative impact that we are thinking, right, in our minds, but that we can still do the evacuation that is necessary. So that was one thing I just wanted to lift up and be real clear on. The other is about some folks had raised about the commuters and commuters coming in and how this will impact them. And I want to honor that. I've noticed a lot more folks using e-bikes to commute because you can come in farther. So I just want to honor that we are changing and using bikes in different ways more. I mean, my bike is my car. And so I really need safe lanes. I need them protected. I prefer the one that has the two sides, on two sides, on one side rather, and not the two. I believe Matt Benjamin brought up the tree canopy. And I mean, if we can keep as much existing canopy as possible over anything that would disrupt both sides, I'm a big fan of. So I wanted to just lift that up. And then just in general, this is not a commit. We will be inconvenienced, right? Whether it be 1 second or 1 minute or whatever it is. But this inconvenience is not just about us. This is about our future generations being able to live and thrive here. We must change the way we do business. We know car-centric is not the way. So I'm just really grateful to be able to continue to extend in the wonderful work that had been done by the other previous councils and staff and community members to get to this point and to carry this forward because I believe in it. I used to live in North Boulder for 8 years, and biking on Iris was always very scary, and it was essential to get through. And to Nicole's earlier comment, I would take the alternative, but it would take me forever to get anywhere because it's really hard. So again, thank you for this. And I think, again, I'm hopeful that this very thorough process can, now we've tried all the things and know the ways that we can try to figure out ways to streamline, because we streamline this process. And to Ryan's earlier comments, I wanted to echo and agree with those as well. But in general, thank you so much.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem Spear, followed by Councilmember Marcus and Councilmember Folkerts.
I just wanted to echo some of the thanks and just say what I really appreciate is how thoughtful you've been in bringing together so many different goals, safety, all this engagement with community and hearing about their needs and desires for the area, thinking about our city's goals as well as our finances, just bringing all of this together. And I'm so eager to hear your recommendation. I feel like, I've just finished that first book, and I really want to see what happens in the sequel. So really looking forward to when you all come back with a recommendation. So thank you.
You, Councilmember Marcus.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really helpful in this iteration of learning about IRIS, where there's, from my perspective, more of a focus on the impact, both the impacts and increases of safety, and also really being upfront with the impacts to people who use the corridor in different ways, including vehicle traffic time. So we know we heard a lot from that community. There's a lot of concern about it. And also being very clear that this meets the thresholds for our medical response teams and our evacuation teams, to the extent that we can underline and highlight that part of the solution with any communication we do to the community, I think is important. And finally, to the notion, and I'll just speak a little bit off the cuff, but I think there might be a way to think about further analyses of these traffic patterns that focus on, if an impact to a vehicle trip is over X amount, then it comes to the council, kind of like a call up sort of thing, or if the budget is over a certain amount. There's a lot of things that traffic needs to do for safety. And I think they're very clear. And I like that you're already looking at that Safeway exit. And of course you can do that without council, but I would like to think about and be creative at how we can help the engagement be more focused and based on impacts and not so much on the design piece, if that's possible. Thanks. I don't know if that made sense.
Councilmember Folkerts.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the work is so great. Thank you so much for such a thorough presentation. And I think my only concern kind of echoes what Ryan was saying of how do we do more faster? It's the next question after you do such an awesome thing. So I think Tina brought up, what can we implement sooner as part of this proposal? And I would be interested in that as well. And then, as others have mentioned, the streamlining in future projects. We don't want to shortchange engagement, but how do we balance those two, I think is really the question. So thank you so much.
Councilmember Weiner, are you double dipping?
I am. I rarely do that. Okay, maybe sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay. I did want to just speak a little bit to the community. I think I forget who was it tonight that was talking, thanking the community for all the letters. And I understand that there's a lot of people worried about those drive times, and I get it because I drive too. But I'm looking at the data, and the data says that it's really going to be like a minute or two, which I think is well worth the risk. But I do want to say for all the non-believers out there that years and years ago, when they were going to change 30th to like 3 lanes, I freaked out and went to went to some sort of a meeting. I was just a regular non-city council member, and I said, "Don't do this to me. You're going to ruin my life." I don't know what I said, but I said some sort of crazy speech. And then 30th Street was recently became just 2 lanes with the center stage because there was a lot of construction. And I can't remember one time that I ever slowed down that entire time that the tunnel was, the underpass was at 30th in Colorado, not one time. So I'm hoping that so that I really do believe it's not going to affect traffic by barely just a minute or two. So I'm hoping that the community gives it a chance and is positive, because I was not a believer either, but 30th Street went right along, back and forth I went, and really just never sat in traffic. So I just wanted to bring that up. Thanks, Mark, for letting me double dip tonight.
And I am going to make my comments, which will be actually concise and very brief. I want to thank staff for a great piece of work. You're doing extremely well in this process. I look forward to our next conversation, and I cannot thank you enough for the work and the diligence you're putting into this project. Thank you. With that, I am going to return the controls to our city manager to introduce our next topic, which will actually be brief.
Well, this is a topic that came up, and perhaps I might turn it to our city attorney, but it really is a question, and well, maybe it's just more of a question that posed to council. There was in the matter of a recent ballot initiative, there was a question that came up on whether council as a body would like to give staff a direction to negotiate with petitioners. And I believe that's really a straw poll and a yes or no question at this point, without more discussion. City Attorney Teresa Taylor Tate, is that an accurate request?
Hi, good evening. Teresa Taylor Tate, City Attorney. That's accurate. And I want to be clear that that a decision to ask staff to engage with the petitioners does not presuppose any decision about the airport. Rather, there could be a few discrete areas for conversation that still completely leaves the decision to council for the July 25th meeting about the future of the airport.
Okay, on that basis, we should take a straw poll. I assume we can do this by show of hands. If you're interested in having some discussion by staff with those petitioners on the language of the initiative, raise your hand. The ayes have it, and I think we're done with that subject.
We appreciate that, council, as staff has an interest, and we will keep you posted.
All right. And seeing no other matters today, I see I have failed in my mission to bring us in with by 9:05, but 9:07 will have to do. And I hope everyone will enjoy their recess. I think it's well earned. And with that, I am going to gavel this meeting to a close at 9:07.